Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Cabbage Head Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Became Hell's Executioner? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku walked home after a long day spent as a training subject. Bandages wrapped parts of his body and tired shadows rested under his eyes. He passed a TV shop where the UA Sports Festival was being broadcast across the country. His sister, Izuku Midorya, was competing against her childhood friend Shoto Todoroki. Spectators outside the shop praised Izuku's skill, wondered about her family, and commented that the Midoryas must be proud. A few people even claimed to know the family and described them as kind. Izuku ignored the crowd and kept walking. When he reached home, he unlocked the door and called for his mother into the empty hallway, but no one answered. He often skipped lunch. Before he could open the homemade meal he had prepared, classmates would pull him into rough practice sessions, using him as a substitute for training with their quirks. He made himself toast and milk, then climbed to his room, hoping sleep would dull the ache of the day. His family returned soon after, weary from their secret work. His mother, Inko, called into the house and his father, Toshinori, said he could see Izuku's shoes on the front porch. Izuku decided to check on her brother. Izuku hurried up the stairs and eased the door open to his room. She found Izuku thrashing in his sleep, sheets damp with sweat. She shook him awake, worried that he had been having a nightmare. Izuku stirred and recoiled from her touch, afraid she might lash out again. He stammered and tried to push her away. Izuku looked at him with shame and asked him to leave. Their mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner while Toshinori watched television. When Inko asked about the noise, Izuku told her it was nothing. The phone rang and Toshinori answered, identifying the Midorya residence. He went silent for a moment, then reacted with visible shock and alarm. After he hung up, he told the family he had to go to UA for a while and asked Izuku not to come with him. Izuku grabbed her coat anyway and insisted that she should go if it was important. Toshinori explained that someone had stolen files containing information about him and the children's quirks. Izuku bristled and demanded to know who would do such a thing. Toshinori hesitated and then said that the reports suggested Izuku might be involved. Inko dropped the utensil she had been holding in surprise and called out Izuku's name in disbelief. A year earlier, before the sludge villain incident, Izuku was pressed against the school building's wall while his bullies Izuku, Shoto, Kaken, and their friends laughed and debated what to do with him. Bakugo, loud and angry, told Izuku that he had warned him to stop dreaming and demanded what that supposed dream had been. Izuku tried to answer. Izumi snapped at him to be quiet and called him a twerp, saying he should stop embarrassing himself because he had no quirk. Shoto warned Izuku not to make his life any harder. The others joined in agreement. Izuku kept thinking he must not cry or show weakness, because that would only invite more bullying. He started to speak, saying that the dream mattered and that he and Bakugo had promised each other something, but he never finished. Bakugo's punch knocked the air from him as it slammed into his stomach. Bakugo hurled an insult, insisting the promise only applied if Izuku had a quirk. More blows followed. Bakugo hit him again and their friends used their quirks on Izuku, leaving him bruised and with bandaged wounds. Izuku told him he was a disappointment to the family and accused him of sullying their name by trying to be the first Quirkless kid at UA. When Izuku kicked him in the face, Izuku's forehead split and began to bleed. Izuku protested that he could be a hero and that he could help, shouting that he could be useful. The violence continued. Izuku renewed his taunts about family shame. When Bakugo asked whether Izuku still wanted to become a hero, Izuku answered that he did. Bakugo then sneered that Izuku should jump from the roof and hope to get a quirk in his next life. Shoto and Izumi reacted in shocked disagreement with Bakugo, and one of the others warned that Bakugo was going too far. Bakugo asked why they cared. Before anyone could decide, Izuku froze and then ran. He dashed out of the school and hid beneath an old bridge. Under the bridge, Izuku struggled with the voices inside his head, one insisting he must not cry, another urging him to believe. He clung to the thought that he could be a hero and must keep believing. While he was lost in his own turmoil, A slick, moving substance crept closer. A liquid-like mass began to force itself toward him, trying to invade his mouth. At that moment, a powerful presence intervened. All Might arrived, sweeping the sludge away with a burst of energy and containing it in a water bottle to be secured later. All Might checked on Izuku, asking if he was all right. Others nearby realized who it was and called out in surprise and relief at All Might's appearance. Izuku seized the chance and hurriedly asked All Might whether someone without a quirk could ever become a hero. All Might looked at him with heavy regret and told Izuku that, in his view, a quirkless person could not hope to defeat villains and that a more practical path might be to go into the police force. He cut himself off when he saw how the words wounded Izuku, and a deeper apology showed in his expression. All Might admitted he could not risk losing someone in whom he had taken an interest. The weight of All Might's words sank into Izuku. He took them to heart and, drained and defeated, allowed himself to give up on that hope for now. He rose, put on his school uniform, and left for another day at school, bracing himself for whatever pain that day would bring. Another day, another burden. Izuku got dressed and did not bother to make his own lunch. He did not expect to eat anyway. The house was empty, and he wondered whether his family had left to avoid facing him. He thought they were being cruel and locked the door behind him as he left. He took a familiar shortcut through a dark alley. It was quiet and sketchy, but at least he was alone. A sound came from above, and he glanced up, expecting a cat, but nothing was there. He almost reached the end of the alley when someone forced him to the ground and pinned his arm. Izuku cried out in pain and demanded to know what was happening, insisting he was no mugger. A voice ordered him to be silent and called him a thief. The voice of the animal-like Principal Nizu declared that Izuku was under arrest for stealing the files containing the quirks of classes 1A and 1B. Another voice protested that they did not yet know the full story. All Might stepped forward and insisted Izuku could not be a villain, pleading that the boy was innocent. Izuku then rushed into the alley, pushed one of the heroes off Izuku, grabbed his arm, and urged him to run. Before Izuku could react, he was pinned again by Katsuki while Shoto helped hold him down. Bakugo ignited a close-range blast that stunned Izuku into stillness. Nizu ordered Kamui Woods to take Izuku to the jet, and Kamui complied. All Might pleaded with Nizu on Izuku's behalf, insisting again that the boy was innocent. Nizu ignored him and warned that not everyone associated with their heroes could be trusted, and that Izuku would face severe consequences. The accusation left Izuku speechless and dizzy with disbelief. He could not understand why anyone would think he had stolen such sensitive files. In the jet, he sat in silence throughout the flight, intimidated by Nizu's small but authoritative presence and by the severity of what was unfolding. Kamui Woods asked Izuku why he had taken the files. Izuku denied any involvement, but Nizu leaned in and insisted that being born without a quirk did not mean someone had to become a villain. Izuku continued to protest that he had not done it. Kamui reminded him that the security cameras had shown someone taking the files, and illogical as it seemed, the villains would have no reason to target someone unknown. Nizu and Kamui exchanged a glance and then revealed something that stunned Izuku. Nizu stated that Izuku's father was All Might. Izuku refused to believe it, but the claim left him reeling. Nizu brusquely told him to be quiet, dismissing his protests, while Kamui spoke of the potential shame such a connection could bring to All Might and the family. Izuku sat and cried quietly, feeling as if his life had been a lie. He had spent his days forcing a smile and enduring hardships that felt like a relentless internal pressure. They arrived at Tartarus, a fortress on an island built to house the worst criminals. Tartarus ran a harsh, punishing program and kept its inmates under strict control and relentless labor. Nizu handed Izuku over to the warden and directed that the boy be given extra supervision and a strict regimen. The warden was a heavily built man who looked as if his physique came from a strengthening quirk. He questioned why a child was being brought there and asked what Izuku had done. Kamui answered that the boy had stolen UA files, and Nizu added that the files contained the student's quirks and vulnerabilities and had allegedly been sold to the League of Villains. The warden laughed in disbelief when he learned Izuku claimed to be quirkless. He glanced between Kamui and Nizu, then laughed again and announced that the assignment would be interesting. The guards led Izuku away under heavy watch. Bruised and wounded, Izuku sat in the corner of his dark, windowless cell at the very top of Tartarus. A loud knock announced it was time for his daily punishment, and Izuku was terrified. For 12 weeks he had been tormented and forced into brutal labor as the other inmates punching bag and errand boy. The guards took part in the cruelty and devised new methods to break him. They exposed him to rats, scalding liquids, corrosive substances, and repeated beatings. No one from his family visited. Izuku had come to expect nothing from them. The warden ordered him away from the door and told him to face the wall with his hands behind his head. The warden, who had decided early on he would personally oversee Izuku, pushed the rusted door open. The warden laughed and made a cruel joke about having fun with the boy. The warden led Izuku into a filthy chamber. In the center stood a vat of searing tar that glowed like molten night. A guard with a healing quirk stood nearby. Their cruel routine was to briefly force Izuku's hand into the tar and then use their power to stitch him back together, ensuring he did not die. Izuku saw the tar, tried to flee, and pleaded for mercy, but the guards ignored him. He begged for his innocence as they forced his hand into the heat. The experience left him gasping and trembling. Hours of abuse narrowed Izuku to a hollow shell. He had cried so often over the past weeks that his tears felt gone. He moved through each day numb and exhausted. The punishment finally culminated in a panic attack that left him wheezing and unable to breathe properly. The warden barked orders to take him back to his cell and to make sure he could stand within an hour because there was more work to be done. The guards dragged him away, dismissive of his suffering. Back in his cell, Izuku crawled toward the door, whispering pleas for help as he coughed and sweated. He slipped into unconsciousness. His breath stilled and his body grew completely still. No one noticed. Izuku awoke not in his cell but in a sky of vivid orange and red. Flames liked the air around him without burning him, casting everything in a strange, unreal light. An elderly man in a tuxedo stood before him, seeming both old and impossibly powerful. Izuku asked who the man was. The man introduced himself as Lucifer, also known as Satan. Izuku asked why he had been brought to this place and whether he had done something wrong. Lucifer explained that he had been brought before him and God because they had a proposition for him. Their old stories of rivalry had ended long ago. Lucifer said he had been pardoned but remained in his realm to punish sinners until they repented. When Izuku asked where the punished souls went, Lucifer explained that they were released back to Earth and reincarnated as new people, the cycle repeating. Izuku questioned why he had been summoned specifically, and Lucifer placed a steady hand on his shoulder, asking him to walk. Izuku complied hesitantly, unsure what to make of the man who called himself Lucifer. They walked as Lucifer outlined his offer. He and God wanted Izuku to become a rider. Lucifer described a rider as someone who collected souls and brought justice to those who used brutality against the innocent, a force that instilled fear in the corrupt. He explained that a rider acted like a hound against evil and, in that way, was a kind of hero who destroyed corruption. Lucifer stopped and looked directly at Midorya, asking whether he would become his rider. Lucifer asked Izuku if he would become his rider while looking into Izuku's eyes. Though Lucifer was the devil, Izuku remembered a line from the Bible. Even though Satan is called evil incarnate, he never tells a direct lie, only exploits loopholes. Izuku asked what the consequences would be if he accepted being Lucifer's rider. Lucifer said there would be none and that Izuku would be free to do as he wished. Izuku felt confused. Not only had the devil offered him power, but he had also offered freedom without clear restraint. When Izuku asked if there were any loopholes or punishments, Lucifer first said no and then amended himself, admitting that there was one limitation. Lucifer explained that the flames of hell would punish those who had sinned greatly and could purify those who truly regretted their actions. He described cursed green flames that would only activate near those who had earned a place in the deepest parts of hell. Those who could still change would not be hurt by them, but the flames would cause immense pain to those who were irredeemable. He further described a power called the penance stare, which would allow Izuku to take the soul and power of someone after inflicting great suffering, and a summon ability that would conjure a ride suited to him. Lucifer recommended a motorcycle. Lucifer finished his explanation and asked if Izuku was satisfied. Izuku stood dumbstruck. The powers sounded like those of a hero, able to burn only villains. Lucifer reminded him that everyone sinned to some degree, and neglecting to use the power would cause harm to others. When Izuku asked if Lucifer could read his thoughts, Lucifer confirmed that he always had. Izuku blushed, aware that Lucifer had heard the worst of his inner thoughts but had acted as if he had not. Lucifer warned that becoming a rider would be painful, that flames would engulf his body and the transformation would be intense. Izuku accepted and asked for a weapon. Lucifer whistled, and the ground trembled as something large approached. Lucifer produced a chain from the collar of a three-headed dog standing behind him, a menacing creature like a mythic guardian. He told the dog to stand down and explained that the chain was special, holding thousands of souls of the sinful and making it fitting for a rider. Lucifer wrapped the chains around Izuku's left arm. They imprinted like a tattoo and then did the same on his right arm. He explained that when Izuku transformed, the chains would extend and act like additional arms. Lucifer instructed Izuku to will the power and demonstrate it. He stepped back and let Izuku try. Izuku concentrated and willed himself to become a rider, to save the innocent and punish the sinful. He fell to all fours as a burning sensation rose within him. The temperature increased, his vision blurred, and he cried out in pain. Flames erupted around him as the chains wrapped and bound him. Lucifer observed that Izuku seemed to be losing control of his emotions. The newly formed rider stood and was momentarily covered in emerald green flames before vanishing. Lucifer sighed and hoped the boy would learn to control himself. Back in the mortal realm, the students of Class 1A chatted and joked as they entered USJ for a training exercise. Kurogiri prepared to separate the students while Shigaraki screamed for All Might's presence, demanding to know where he was. Aizawa told Shigaraki that All Might was not there. Shigaraki responded that he would have to kill a few children to get All Might's attention, and then ordered Nomu to attack. Nomu surged at Aizawa with terrifying speed, landing blow after blow and sending Aizawa crashing into the stairs. Nomu kept attacking relentlessly, throwing Aizawa and battering him in a brutal but non-graphic display of force. Another student tried to help but was confronted by Kurogiri. Her quirk misfired and left her immobilized. The students panicked. Ida sped away to get help, Bakugo was restrained by Momo to prevent reckless action, and others tried to protect classmates who were being cornered by villains near the water. Aizawa was badly overwhelmed. All Might appeared, but his time was nearly gone and he could not fully intervene. He watched as Aizawa was beaten and struggled under the assault. As Nomu prepared to strike a final blow, the ground between Nomu and Aizawa exploded into emerald green flames. A skeletal figure wearing a black trench coat with spikes on the shoulders appeared, chains wrapped around him as he gave a deep laugh. The flames dispersed, and the figure pointed at Nomu, calling him an abomination. Everyone fell silent. The figure that had appeared between the Nomu and Aizawa did not look particularly human, and Shigaraki reacted with fearful disbelief that it could not be an ally. The newly formed rider walked toward the Nomu, melting the ground in his wake. Shigaraki, sensing danger, ordered the Nomu to kill the rider. The Nomu lunged for the rider's head and missed. The rider dodged with astonishing speed and struck the Nomu in the stomach, sending it flying. Shigaraki shouted in shock. The rider looked at Shigaraki and derided him as a man-child, warning that Shigaraki would be next. Shigaraki shivered as the rider advanced. Kurogiri, seeing Shigaraki frozen with fear, created a warp gate in front of the rider, but the rider phased through as if the gate were not even there. An unspoken rule seemed to govern the rider. Once he chose a target, he would not let it escape as long as his flame burned. Kurogiri commanded the Nomu to protect Shigaraki. A loud explosion echoed from the other side of USJ and the rider was thrown back. The rider rose from the rubble, vowing retribution. The Nomu pounced again but failed. The rider moved with impossible speed and manipulated his chains to wrap around the Nomu. The chains tightened with each struggle until the Nomu could no longer move his arms or legs. The chains glowed and singed the Nomu, but its regeneration staved off serious harm. The rider stepped forward and accused the Nomu of being an abomination without a soul, saying it would burn in this world. He touched the Nomu's head. A bright flare of light enveloped the creature and it dissolved, leaving no trace behind. Both villains and students, teachers and heroes alike trembled with fear at how easily the rider had neutralized the Nomu. Shigaraki erupted in outrage, accusing the rider of cheating. The rider met Shigaraki's fury with a look and moved closer. Shigaraki ran toward Kurogiri, panicked, and vowed he would get the rider next time. Then the league began to disappear. The rider searched for other sinners nearby. He found All Might as the nearest target. All Might tried to rise but could not do so without revealing his weakened form. The rider approached cautiously. The flames around him cooled to a blue-green tint and his movements became almost tentative, as if reaching out with guarded compassion toward All Might. That moment was interrupted when a bullet struck the rider's hand, snapping him back to red flame. His fire flared fiercely. Reinforcements arrived at the entrance and froze at the sight of the flaming figure. Sniper fire raked the rider, bullets passing through his arms and legs with no effect on their target. The shooting ceased when a roaring motorcycle smashed through the entrance toward the rider, carrying another attacker. The rider wrapped his chains around his arm, mounted the motorcycle, and laughed as he prepared to leave, promising to return for the sinners. He tore through the Colosseum wall and sped away, leaving a trail of fire. Everyone remained frozen in place, stunned by what they had just witnessed. The streets of Mizudafu were in chaos. Civilians told the heroes that a vigilante with a fire quirk much like Endeavor's had been confronting criminals across the city, from petty thieves to hardened offenders. Reporters broadcast that the figure rode a blazing motorcycle and that numerous people had become casualties under mysterious circumstances. Authorities suspected the individual possessed two quirks, one of flame and another with an unexplained lethal effect. The police urged citizens to remain vigilant as reporters pressed for more details and whether the vigilante had first appeared during the USJ incident. At Nizu turned off the television and faced his staff and the visiting heroes. He asked for an explanation of what had happened at USJ. Aizawa explained that a group calling themselves the League of Villains had appeared at USJ claiming to possess something that could kill All Might. All Might confirmed he had seen the device and that, although it had enough power to overpower him, it had not killed him. Nizu listened, exhaling heavily, and then asked about the skeletal Nomu. Everyone tensed. They still feared the memory. Aizawa questioned whether the Nomu could have enough power to kill All Might. All Might nodded that a direct fight would leave him badly battered, but the Nomu had been dealt with quickly. Nizu suggested calling Endeavor the element of fire against fire might be their best chance. Far from the school, a newly reborn rider sped across the city. Flames lighted the road as he raced, driven by a relentless purpose. He passed an old man who looked familiar and did not stop. In the rider's mind, the sinners had to be purged. A voice calm and commanding told him to restrain himself, to let his hatred cool, and to head for the mountains. He slowed, letting the flames subside, and followed the voice's instruction. At the mountain ridge, the rider's motorcycle vanished in an instant and he collapsed to the ground, clutching his face as his skin and body reformed around him. The process lasted a few minutes until it ceased. When he looked up, Lucifer stood before him with a smile and extended a hand. The rider took it and rose. The rider, Izuku, spoke with confusion that the rider form did not feel like a proper quirk. Lucifer laughed and reminded him of the penance stare. Izuku suddenly recalled the USJ incident and the thought that he had killed 45 people overwhelmed him. He became nauseated and wretched. Lucifer reassured him that the situation was not what it seemed. The penance stare affected sinners so that their sins were exposed, allowing lesser demons to take their souls. While the authorities had reported deaths, Lucifer explained that the bodies remained. What had changed was the presence of their souls. Izuku steadied himself, struggling to accept that he was not a murderer in the way he feared. He asked Lucifer what he meant by quirks. Lucifer explained that the penance stare gave Izuku the chance to seize the quirks of those he used it on. Lucifer had modified it to take only quirks that strengthened Izuku's physical and mental capacities, as well as those of his rider form. Because Izuku had used the ability on many people, only a fraction of those quirks were useful. Lucifer listed the results. Lucifer told Izuku that he had gained the following abilities: enhanced strength, and improved regeneration that combined lesser regenerative traits into a more robust recovery, advanced fire manipulation merged with cursed flames to form an enduring flame, brief invisibility, with its duration extended, a dominator's touch multiplied in effectiveness, a sonic ability that could emit a high-pitched sound capable of rendering an opponent unconscious, and a calm mind trait designed to steady emotions and prevent loss of control. Izuku was stunned and thrilled to finally have quirks, but Lucifer covered his mouth and hushed him. Lucifer warned that someone was approaching and urged Izuku to transform. Izuku hesitated, afraid he might lose control, but Lucifer reminded him that his calm mind trait would prevent that unless he became seriously enraged. With that, Lucifer melted into the shadows of the trees. Izuku willfully became the Ghost Rider once more, transforming this time without pain. He sensed a sinner nearby, located about 10 kilometers to the north. Izuku walked toward the distant bright light. When he stepped into the clearing, he was suddenly enveloped in unfamiliar flames. Endeavor stood before him, flames liking his body, and declared that the killings must end, accusing the figure of being a villain. Izuku replied that he had not killed anyone. He said he had taken wrongdoers to judgment, calling them sinners, and turned the accusation back on Endeavor. Endeavor recoiled at being called a sinner. He could not accept the label. He was the number 2 hero, and in his mind heroes were not sinners. Izuku introduced himself as Rider, the Ghost Rider, claiming to be a spirit of vengeance and messenger of divine wrath. Endeavor lunged at him. Endeavor struck with a fiery punch that would have incinerated a normal person. The flames, however, only seemed to fuel Izuku, who stood his ground and laughed. He summoned chains and let them whirl, choosing to prolong the fight rather than finish it quickly. When Endeavor fired a concentrated burn, Izuku used the chains to disperse the blast, taunting the hero and ridiculing his pride. He lashed the chains around Endeavor, flinging him out of the mountain and into the city below. Izuku mounted a motorcycle and rode down into the city. As sirens wailed and news crews converged, Endeavor staggered to his feet in torn armor, bracing himself as the rumble of the bike approached. Izuku announced to the gathered crowd that they should evacuate to avoid the crossfire, laughing at the sight of citizens fleeing as if sinners were running from judgment. Endeavor mocked Izuku's claim to heroism and demanded to know what he was. Izuku insisted he brought order by destroying those who sinned and challenged Endeavor's own moral standing, asking whether Endeavor's family truly saw him as a hero. The accusation unnerved Endeavor. Izuku pressed harder, alleging that Endeavor had forced his wife into a hospital and driven his children to suffering in pursuit of creating a perfect successor to claim the top spot. He suggested they ask Shoto Todoroki about the truth. Endeavor erupted, furious that the children would be dragged into the dispute, and unleashed Prominence Burn, his most overwhelming attack. Endeavor's attack sent a massive wave of fire and energy across the area. Buildings were blasted and the landscape around them was devastated in a sweeping, anime-style display of power. Cameras everywhere captured the impact, and the footage spread rapidly. News anchors reported that Endeavor had destroyed swaths of the city and that the attacker might not have survived the retaliation. At UA High, Izumi, Shoto, and Bakugo sat in the common room of their dorm revisiting the incident at the USJ training site. Izumi wondered whether the Rider might be a force for good. Shoto pointed out the reports that blamed the Rider for dozens of deaths, arguing that the scale of the destruction suggested villainy. Bakugo dismissed their worry and admitted he thought the Rider had made a dramatic, almost heroic entrance when it had saved them. Mina and the rest of Class 1A joined the discussion. Yayazuro agreed with the cautionary view and reminded them that the Rider had been heading toward All Might. No one could be sure what his intentions were. Kirishima noted that the skeleton figure had appeared to approach All Might slowly and deliberately, as if drawn to him. They debated the Rider's nature until Bakugo, exasperated, turned the television on. The broadcast showed live footage of the confrontation, Rider taunting Endeavor and the two of them locked in battle. The students watched as the scene unfolded on screen, each trying to reconcile the contradictory images of a vengeful, fiery stranger and the hero who had once stood for protection. Shoto kept staring at the screen until the writer spoke his name. The others turned to look at him, but Shoto remained frozen, eyes fixed on the television, wondering if the skeleton would come for him next. When he finally tore his gaze away, the scene was chaos. Reporters cried out, and Bakugo lunged toward Shoto to grab him, but something tugged at Shoto's shirt from behind and he vanished. Back at the fight, Endeavor had sworn that no one would harm his children and had unleashed Prominence Burn to stop the threat. For a moment he thought he had succeeded. The writer laughed as smoke cleared, and Endeavor's world collapsed when he realized the writer was unharmed and had Shoto Todoroki by the neck. Endeavor could not understand how it had happened. The writer faced the camera and demanded that Shoto reveal the sins of his father to all of Japan. The broadcast left viewers stunned and anxious. The writer willed chains to wrap around Shoto while Endeavor stood there, clutching at the possibility that he still had his son. Todoroki struggled against the restraints, but the writer ignored him, certain he could not break free. The writer ordered Endeavor to confess his sins and threatened that his son could be made to speak on his behalf. Endeavor hesitated, fearing that any attack would endanger Shoto and ruin his reputation. Reporters informed viewers that Endeavor's son had appeared out of nowhere and questioned what Endeavor would do next. The writer laughed and forced Endeavor to his knees with the Dominator's touch quirk, commanding the old man to remain silent. The writer then turned his attention to Shoto and urged him to speak. Shoto stayed motionless. Endeavor shouted for his son to run, but Shoto only looked at him with blank eyes. Reporters on the scene voiced confusion and concern about the writer's motives. The writer instructed Shoto to look at the cameras. Atyu, Nizu, All Might, Aizawa, and the other heroes watched the broadcast, hoping for good news. For half an hour they had seen nothing but Endeavor losing ground and his son held captive. Nizu ordered everyone to aid Endeavor, and Aizawa warned that the writer was dangerous. The writer had already dispatched a powerful Nomu with ease. All Might decided to go ahead to the scene and urged the others to follow, while Nizu cautioned them to be careful. On live television, Shoto spoke about his past. He recounted that his father had not loved his mother and had married her to create someone who could wield two quirks. Endeavor had trained him relentlessly from the age of 4 to become number 1, despite Shoto's mother begging him to stop. Shoto said his mother had one day lost control and splashed water on his left side. She had apologized afterward, but Endeavor had paid and arranged for her to be placed in a mental hospital. Shoto recalled that his brother Tuya had left home and was presumed gone, and that Endeavor's obsession was always to surpass All Might. His confession left the assembled heroes and villains in stunned silence. Dabi understood all too well what kind of man Endeavor had been, and the writer watched with an unsettling smile. The writer leaned close to Endeavor's ear and told him that he had been repented. Endeavor lashed out wildly with a barrage of attacks: Final Flash, Hell Spider, Prominence Burn, but nothing took hold. The writer explained that the effect he'd used made Endeavor's quirk unstable and temporarily nullified it. The writer snapped his fingers and brought Shoto back from the trance. Shoto asked what had been done to him. The writer said he had brought out Shoto's deepest desires to see his father fall, but then shifted focus. The writer hinted at a connection to Izuku Midorya and said that Shoto would learn more in time, though he had to leave now because he sensed another disturbance. A short pause in the broadcast bridged the moment as the writer prepared to move on. A sudden commotion heralded All Might's arrival. All Might dropped from the sky and declared he would not allow a child to be harmed. The writer asked how All Might knew him, claiming that Izuku had told him about All Might in the afterlife. All Might moved with blinding speed and grabbed a young man present by the collar, demanding an explanation. The writer then claimed that Izuku had died alone the previous day from the torture he had endured. All Might refused to believe it and vowed vengeance against anyone responsible. The writer only laughed and said the guard had not killed the boy. The writer accused All Might and his family of being involved. The young man shoved All Might with enough force to send him into a nearby building. He then climbed onto a motorcycle and told All Might to check Tartarus if he wanted to learn the truth. With a mocking laugh, he sped away into the distance. Reporters immediately began asking whether All Might had a son. The question rippled through the media. Back at UA, Fu asked Izumi if she had a brother and what the man had meant by Tartarus. Izumi's eyes filled with tears at the suggestion that her brother might be gone. The possibility left her shaken and grieving as the broadcast continued to reverberate. The heroes arrived on the battlefield too late and asked where All Might had gone. Endeavor stood motionless. His quirk had returned, but his reputation lay in ruins. Hearing his son's accusations had forced him to see what kind of a father he had been. Nizu checked on All Might and asked if he was all right. All Might did not answer. He only stood trembling, his smile gone and the sparkle in his blue eyes dimmed. Nizu told the assembled heroes that it appeared the assailant had escaped and ordered them to search the area for casualties, warning All Might that his time was nearly up. Nizu reached for All Might's shirt to snap him out of his trance, but All Might seized Nizu and pulled him close, demanding in a dangerous tone to know where his son was. The heroes and the nation watched in fear as the usually cheerful symbol of peace showed raw, frightening anger. Nizu, terrified, insisted that he had done nothing malicious and that he had handed the boy over to the guards in Tartarus. All Might reacted with fury and launched himself toward Tartarus. Nizu scrambled and called the warden, who at first pretended not to know the name. The warden then told Nizu that the boy had died the previous night. According to the guards, the boy had a panic attack and could not breathe. Nizu dropped to his knees, sweating and stunned. Aizawa asked what was wrong, and Nizu confirmed the tragic news. Reporters erupted. The public had just witnessed 3 astonishing developments. A skeleton calling himself the Ghost Rider had defeated the number 2 hero, Shoto had confessed his sins, and the number 1 hero, the man who always smiled, had been seen in distress. At you, Bakugo pressed a hand to his face to hide his expression, and Izumi wept uncontrollably. Kirishima told Lita to let her be. They wanted answers, but it was not the time. All Might landed on the island where Tartarus stood with a crashing impact. Guards assumed he was a threat and prepared to act, and one guard, clearly shaken and intimidated, fled to fetch the warden. When the warden emerged, All Might demanded to know why he had been brought there. The warden stammered that the boy had died. All Might, voice steady, asked where the body was so he could bury him properly. The warden pointed to the burial area behind Tartarus. All Might warned the warden that if they were ever in trouble, he would no longer come to their aid. He then walked to the grave and found the boy's body wrapped and placed near a freshly dug plot. All Might gathered the boy, hugged him tightly and apologized, admitting he had been a poor father who had neglected him. He only stopped when Nizu arrived and told him it was time to go. All Might said he would continue working at UA, but not for Nizu, for his daughter. Nizu nodded and led All Might onto the jet. Crime dropped dramatically in Japan over the next few days as criminals and villains stayed hidden, afraid of the Ghost Rider. For most people, life went back to a fragile normal. It was a sunny day. The boy watched from a distance as his family buried his mortal shell 6 feet under. His father All Might had not bothered to disguise himself. How he had hoped to see that smile again. Surprisingly, there were no reporters or paparazzi in the vicinity. The only people who attended his funeral were his mother, father, sister, Bakugo, Shoto, and the rest of Class 1A. Izumi sobbed, and Izuku's mother did the same. All Might remained silent and did not cry, but Izuku understood that All Might's world had been shaken. Izuku was surprised to see his sister crying. He thought it sincere, something he had not expected from her. He thought that she did care and reflected that if only she had shown it years ago. Izuku stepped away into the shadows. Aizawa entered the classroom and announced that All Might was going through something and would not be joining them for the training camp. Ida raised his hand to ask who would accompany them on the camping trip. Aizawa replied that he would, that Vlad and the rest of Class 1B would join, and that 4 other heroes would be present as well. Momo asked who the other heroes would be. Aizawa said they would find out and told the class to go home and rest because they had a big day of training tomorrow. Class 1A packed up and went home. Izumi, who was usually accompanied by Shoto and Bakugo, decided to walk alone. Bakugo complained that she should stop sulking and insisted that she had hated Deku anyway. Shoto scolded Bakugo, reminding him that Deku was part of the family and that Izumi had only acted that way to keep Deku from coming to UA. Bakugo scoffed and asked Shoto about his father. Shoto said that Endeavor had kept training constantly but had recently surprised his family by changing. Later that evening Izumi arrived home and called out that she was back. Inko welcomed her and Izumi noticed the bags under her mother's eyes. Inko had been crying as well. Izumi asked where their father was, and Inko said he was upstairs in Izuku's room. Izumi went upstairs and saw Izuku's bedroom door slightly ajar. Toshinori greeted her with a tired smile. He was in his weakened form and appeared to be clearing up Izuku's room. Inko asked Toshinori why he was not coming tomorrow. Toshinori said that if they wanted him to, he would go. Inko told him to rest instead. She hugged him and then left. Some time passed while the groups prepared for the camping trip and faced various challenges. Class 1B later arrived and the training continued. A child named Kota sat alone on a mountain, minding his own business, when footsteps approached behind him. He turned and saw a young man in a black trench coat with unruly green hair. The young man sat beside Kota and offered him a store-bought lunch, introducing himself as Izuku and urging Kota to eat so he would not starve. Kota accepted the food but did not eat immediately. Kota asked if Izuku was a hero, his expression full of resentment. Izuku asked whether Kota really hated heroes that much. Kota said that heroes did nothing but chase their dreams and sometimes left people behind for that pursuit. Izuku asked whether Kota really believed that about his parents. Kota stiffened and demanded how Izuku knew that his parents were dead. Izuku took Kota's hat and put it on, and when Kota tried to grab it back, Izuku dodged. Kota accused Izuku of lying and insisted that his parents were dead. Izuku told Kota that being dead did not mean they could not speak. Kota swung at Izuku, but Izuku dodged repeatedly until Kota grew exhausted. Izuku then asked if Kota was ready to listen. Kota, out of breath, confirmed that his parents were dead. Izuku relayed a message he claimed his parents had left, that they were sorry for leaving, that they had thought of Kota even after they were gone, and that they loved him and would always be with him in spirit. Kota broke down and cried from deep in his chest, thanking his parents and saying he loved them. His tears fell into the cold night as the moonlight seemed to shine a little brighter. Izuku hugged Kota and then walked away. Kota asked hopefully whether he would see the man again. Izuku smiled, told Kota to say his name and he would take the demons away, and then disappeared. Lucifer observed that he had been the right person. Gabriel remarked that he would bring peace when the time of ruin came. A scream echoed through the night. The next day, everyone noticed how Kota had changed. He said he liked heroes now because someone had saved him the night before. Mandalay asked Kota what he meant, but Kota only shook his head and smiled. Izumi and the others also noticed that Kota seemed to want to get closer to Izumi. Mandalay assumed it was a simple crush and offered advice on how to catch a lady's attention. Kota denied having a crush and said that Izumi simply reminded him of his savior. Izumi asked him why, and Kota explained that it was because of her green hair. Izumi was surprised. No one else had green hair except her brother. She tried to get Kota to describe his savior, but he was already walking away. She decided she would ask him about it later. A short time later, during the test of courage, the fifth pair from Class 1A, Achiko and Tsuyu, entered the forest. Juzo and Itsuka praised Yui for her scare tactic. Suddenly smoke appeared, causing Juzo to faint. Itsuka recognized the smoke as dangerous, covered her mouth, and protected Yui with her quirk to prevent her from inhaling it. Achiko and Tsuyu noticed flames deeper in the forest, and while their attention was on the fire, they failed to notice a blonde-haired child sneaking up behind them. Poisonous smoke spread through the trees, and the pussycats and the rest of Class 1A saw dark smoke rising. Somewhere within the woods, Dabi directed the League of Villains Vanguard Action Squad to attack. Mandalay ordered everyone to evacuate the forest and find the nearest teacher, stressing that this was not a drill. The students panicked, especially Class 1B. Izumi was with Mandalay and Tiger. Pixie Bob lay unconscious after being struck by a large piece of metal held by Magna. Her quirk was magnetism. Mandalay asked Izumi if she had seen Kota. Izumi replied that she had not, but believed she knew where he might be. She said he often went toward the mountain and asked permission to go look for him. Mandalay granted permission and urged her to go at once. Izumi did not hesitate and ran toward the mountain, dodging Spinner's attack along the way. On the mountain, Kota sat waiting for Izuku, hoping to see him again. He heard footsteps behind him and turned, expecting the boy who had saved him, but instead found a masked man. Mandalay reached Kota telepathically and told him to return to the facility because villains were at the site. She apologized for being unable to help him directly. The masked man made a casual comment about Kota's hat and the mask he was forced to wear, as if offering to trade. As the masked man removed his mask, Kota ran, but the man used his quirk to leap in front of him. Seeing the man's face, Kota froze in shock. He remembered news reports about the villain who had killed his parents, a man known for augmented strength and a deep scar across his left eye. Realization hit Kota that this man was the same villain. The scarred man readied himself to strike. Kota, paralyzed by fear, cried out for Izuku. The villain was about to attack when the rev of a motorcycle split the air. Both heroes and villains stopped and turned toward the sound as a bright orange light approached through the trees. A flaming motorcycle burst from the forest. Mandalay dodged as the rider barreled toward the mountain at full speed. Magna and Spinner showed signs of fear, but the rider did not slow down, driving straight toward the scene. The rider passed Izumi on his motorcycle and grabbed her while still driving at full speed. Izumi pleaded to be let go and flailed, turning to see who had seized her, her face flushed with shock, fear, and disbelief in rapid succession. Izumi recognized the rider and called his name. The rider told her to stop flailing because Kota needed them. Izumi froze, wondering what Kota had to do with any of this. A burly man nearby jeered at the child and asked why he had shouted a name, wondering if the Izuku was a hero. He reached toward Kota, but a heavy chain suddenly wrapped around his arm and seared with an intense heat. The man screamed as the chain yanked him toward the mountain cliff. He strained against the chain, pulling like a fisherman reeling in a massive catch. When the rope drew him in, he realized it led to the skeletal rider on the motorcycle, who held a small, strange bundle. The rider asked the man whether he liked his catch of the day. Izuku, in his rider form, threw Izumi toward Kota and urged the child to follow her, insisting that she was capable of keeping them both safe. Izumi rose, slung Kota over her shoulders and ran. The burly man Muscular continued to taunt the rider. While he struggled with the motorcycle, Izuku warned that Muscular's crimes would not go unpunished. Muscular managed to pull the motorcycle up onto the mountain and told the rider not to get cocky as he prepared to fight. Muscular shed his cloak and activated his quirk. The rider responded in kind. The clash between them unfolded like a fierce, high-energy duel straight out of an anime. Blinding speed, crashing impacts, and sparks of power flaring across the mountainside. Muscular had overwhelmed other opponents before, but the rider proved far tougher than he expected. Muscular unleashed a series of crushing blows, only to find each attack met an unyielding defense. He struck again with devastating force, shaking the earth, but the rider remained standing without visible injury. Muscular taunted the rider as he attacked, but the rider replied with a dry remark, asking as a jest for Muscular to try punching his left shoulder, which unsettled Muscular. Izuku advanced slowly, his blue flames flaring to a deeper, almost crimson hue. He reminded Muscular that even the smallest thing could cause a grown man to falter. Muscular tried to go all out, fumbling in his pocket and dropping several glass eyes before fitting a red one in place. He wrapped himself in thicker muscle fibers to boost his strength and lunged. Izuku caught Muscular's arm and forced the man to confront the harm he had caused. The rider's words pressed on Muscular's conscience, showing him the weight of his actions and the suffering left in his wake. Overwhelmed and unable to continue, Muscular went rigid and collapsed, immobilized by the rider's power. Izuku offered a quiet wish for his peace and then remounted his motorcycle, heading back toward Kota. Izumi ran through winding paths with Kota on her back, panic thrumming in her chest as she tried to stay ahead of the ghostly rider. Kota struggled and protested that he needed to help, his voice trembling with tears. Izumi insisted it was too dangerous, especially with the skeleton figure in pursuit. Kota sobbed, worried that returning would only make him a burden to Izuku, whom he recognized by his clothes. Izumi saw the rider's blue fire spreading ahead, and she realized the danger was growing. Her quirk, psychokinesis, allowed her to influence physical systems without touching them, and she braced herself to use it to protect them both. Mandalay felt the tiger attacks growing weaker with each hit. Fatigue was overtaking her. Pixie Bob was unconscious and Ragdoll did not answer. She wondered where Vlad and Eraserhead were as she dodged another strike from Spinner and kicked him in the face. Spinner laughed, telling Mandalay that she really packed a punch. He ordered Magna to act, and Magna used her quirk to make Mandalay float towards Spinner, who poised his sword to slice the hero the moment she entered his kill zone. Tiger tried to run to Mandalay but was stopped by Magna, who mocked his attempt to save her. Mandalay closed her eyes, bracing for impact, when she felt something wrap around her leg and suddenly pull her in the opposite direction. She opened her eyes and then closed them again as she saw a skeleton on a motorbike, a bony hand reaching out to pull her. The fingers felt strangely gentle. Gathering her courage, she opened her eyes and saw the skull an inch from her face. She screamed into the night, and the students in the forest feared the worst. Izuku dropped her to the ground with a thud. Mandalay tried to rise but was steadied by Izumi and Kota. She clung to Kota while Izumi urged her to rest. Izuku scolded her for ruining a dramatic entrance and wrapped his chains around his arm once more. Mandalay began to thank him but stuttered. Izuku told her to save her breath and reminded her that her job was not over. There were students trapped deeper in the forest and he needed her to find them. Mandalay nodded and asked Izumi to look after Kota while she searched for their classmates. Izuku moved forward, sensing the guilt of Spinner and Magna, and announced that they would begin the purge. Spinner and Magna decided to retreat, admitting they could not take Izuku. They ran into the forest toward their pickup point. Izuku followed on foot, thinking how foolish they were to try to run from him. A Class 1B student, Ibra Shiozaki, had been walking alone in the forest. She had encountered a Class 1A student with a bird-like head earlier and fled because he had seemed unstable. She heard shuffling behind her and turned to see two figures running deeper into the trees. When she tried to call out, a hand clamped over her mouth and a warm, bright light flared. Its source felt skeletal. A hoarse voice told her not to ruin the fun. Fear rose in her chest. She realized the figure was the infamous rider. The rider spoke softly, saying he would not harm someone who had caused very little harm, and asked for her name. Ibra gave her name. The rider instructed her to turn around and walk until she reached a clearing where she would meet Tiger and a Class 1A student, then let her go. Ibra hesitated, but her belief that even villains deserved mercy pushed her to follow him, moving silently to avoid alarming him. The rider hoped she would not be a trouble. Spinner burst from the trees with Magna close behind and called to Dabi to get out. Dabi asked calmly if they had the target. Spinner rushed past and told Kurogiri to open a portal quickly. Magna, out of breath, warned that the rider was present. Dabi reacted with wide eyes and urged haste. Kurogiri said not to move until they had secured the target. Spinner screamed that they should abandon the mission and flee, but Kurogiri remained composed and ordered them to wait for the others. Spinner cursed under his breath while Magna collapsed in exhaustion. Dabi pushed into the forest to search for the others and the target as quickly as possible. Unknown to them, a figure with an extinguished flame and a skeletal appearance watched from nearby, careful not to reveal his identity to anyone behind him. Meanwhile, Shoto engaged a restrained villain known as Moonfish, using his ice to block the villain's teeth-enlarging quirk. Moonfish proved highly skilled, breaking through Shoto's ice and nearly striking Bakugo before Shoto intercepted. Shoto warned Bakugo against using any ignition quirk, explaining that an explosion might ignite the poisonous gas in the area. Bakugo bristled but understood that using his power could make things worse. Moonfish continued to break through ice defenses and used his teeth to maneuver. Determined that retreat was impossible without getting caught in the gas, leaving him and Bakugo trapped. A giant shadow claw seemed poised to strike Bakugo when Mizo appeared, grabbing Bakugo and urgently asking for a small source of light just bright enough to calm Dark Shadow. Mizo explained that he and Fumikage had been ambushed by Moonfish. Mizo had covered for Fumikage and lost one of his tentacles in the process. The ambush had caused Fumikage to lose control of Dark Shadow, which had grown larger and more aggressive. Dark Shadow had begun to restrain and overpower Fumikage, who struggled and pleaded for the others to run. Shoto noticed that the gas was beginning to clear and prepared a small, controlled flame around his left arm, but Bakugo stopped him, fearing the risk of ignition. Dark Shadow suddenly struck Moonfish with a massive claw, incapacitating him. Shoto and Katsuki were stunned. Dark Shadow threw the defeated Moonfish aside. With Moonfish out of the way, Katsuki and Shoto closed in on Fumikage and used their quirks to calm Dark Shadow. The creature shrank and retracted back into Fumikage, allowing Fumikage to return to normal. Shoto was about to high-five Bakugo when Bakugo vanished. Shoto called Bakugo's name into the forest and then heard laughter from above the trees. He looked up to see a masked man holding a bright blue pebble and announcing that the target had been acquired. Somewhere else in the forest at the rendezvous point, Dabi, Twice, and Toga listened to Mr. Compress's report. Dabi observed that there was nothing in the air and no tremors beneath their feet. He warned that they might be the only ones left and urged Kurogiri to move. Dabi turned to find Kurogiri on the ground with a glowing skeleton standing over him. Time seemed to slow for the villains as the skeleton flared and its chains wrapped around Twice, immobilizing him. In another part of the forest, Yosetsu carried an injured Momo while fleeing from the Vanguard Action Squad's Nomu. The Nomu tore through the trees with its weaponized arms, chainsaws, drills, and hammers closing in on Yosetsu. Just as the Nomu prepared to strike, one of its chainsaw arms halted. It retracted its weapon arms into its body and began walking back toward the Vanguard rendezvous point. Momo realized the Nomu had been called back because the villains had captured Katsuki. Thinking quickly, Momo fashioned a small device that looked like a tracker and asked Yosetsu to weld it onto the Nomu. Yosetsu complied, using his quirk to bond the device to the Nomu. With Momo's tracker attached, the Nomu walked away and the two took the chance to escape. Outside the forest, Mandalay and Tiger tended to the now-awake Pixie Bob and noticed Yosetsu carrying the injured Momo. After a brief explanation, Mandalay and Tiger ran toward the villains' rendezvous point. The villains were locked in a tense standoff with the rider. Twice and Mr. Compress lay on the floor, frozen in fear. Izuku was about to move on Dabi when a wall of writhing green vines blocked him. He sighed, thinking she would be a bother, and asked Ibra to let him through, explaining that he did not want to hurt someone who seemed innocent. Ibra flushed but refused. She closed her eyes, made a prayer-like gesture, and invoked her quirk. Her hair elongated into vines and bound Izuku in a cruciform hold. Izuku laughed at the irony and allowed the other villains to try to flee, but they were intercepted by Mandalay and Tiger, accompanied by Shoto, Mizo, and Izumi. The rescuers fought back, leaving Ibra alone with the rider. Izuku demanded to know why Ibra sided with the heroes. Ibra maintained that she did not side with them and insisted she was trying to prevent him from committing further harm. Izuku challenged her, asking which was worse, the one who kills evil or the one who protects it. Ibra shouted that they were the same, which amused Izuku. He agreed and suggested that they were now killing. He implied that she was defending. Then he ignited the vines around him and rushed at Ibra. Ibra froze until the sound of a chainsaw cut through the air. She turned to see a red Nomu raising its arms to strike. Izuku pulled her out of the path just in time. The weapon passed dangerously close but did not hit her. Izuku then taunted who was evil now. She used her quirk on both herself and Kota to speed things up. If she tried to fly using her quirk, she would grow nauseated because of the drawback. The fire was spreading closer to Izumi and Kota. Izumi swore that they were so close, forgetting that a child was behind her. Kota did not mind. He understood she needed to focus and must not be disturbed. The blue flames edged nearer, and Izumi considered using her quirk to make Kota float toward the base when the sound of a motorcycle engine approached. A single thought raced through Izumi's mind. They were screwed. She tried to run faster, but fatigue overtook her. She pushed herself until something suddenly pulled her upward and onto a motorcycle seat. The rider had tempered the flames around the motorcycle so they would not burn Kota, though he still looked stern toward his sister. In front of Izumi was the rider. In front of the rider, receiving a front row spot, was Kota. Izumi screamed. The writer Izuku told Izumi that she should not swear in front of children, turning his head to look at her without taking his eyes off the road. He said he would judge her later, but for now her duty was to protect the boy. Izuku silenced Kota by covering the child's mouth and making a shushing motion, then told Kota that they would be making an entrance and that he would make sure the boy had the best front row seat to see the downfall of the villains. Kota beamed with excitement and cheered that he was ready. Izuku laughed, and Izumi thought to herself that she had thought he was a villain. Izuku carried Ibra in his arms and dodged the Nomu's many grappling limbs. Ibra flushed but held on tightly, terrified that letting go would leave her vulnerable. Izuku noticed that Ibra was trembling and asked softly if she had been hurt. Ibra shook her head and insisted she was fine, but his face remained full of concern. He asked again if she was really okay. She huffed and forcefully insisted she was. She regarded the skull-like mask he wore with a piercing gaze and found he was not as bad as she had first thought. He set her down and urged her to run, but she insisted on helping. After a brief argument, Izuku accepted her offer to stay and assist. Ibra activated her quirk, via Dolorosa, and her vines spread everywhere, snaking out to ensnare any creature within reach and holding them fast with thorned grips. Despite her gentle appearance, she revealed a streak of righteous anger that intrigued Izuku. She swore that the schemers would be judged, and Izuku complimented the strength of her vines. She nodded with a slight smile. Izuku advanced toward the Nomu with his chains burning a deep red. Ibra pleaded with the rider to show mercy, arguing that the Nomu, though mindless, still deserved compassion. Izuku only shook his head and indicated he had none to spare. To keep her from interfering, he immobilized Ibra with the Dominator's touch. He charged his chains with a hellish power and prepared to strike the Nomu, but a sudden chill made him turn. All for One stood there, his arms pulsing with dark energy. Izuku dropped his chains and rushed back toward Ibra, reaching for her as All for One unleashed an attack. Izuku grabbed her and faced the blast himself. The assault did not kill him, but it was powerful enough to force him back into his human form and leave him badly shaken. The impact tore through half the forest, the thunder of it rolling for miles. Mandalay and her companions turned and saw All for One. Mandalay was terrified by the devastation. Izumi and Shoto were stunned for different reasons. A green-haired boy stood before All for One. Izuku bore small scratches and looked battered, though he tried to conceal his pain. Izumi whispered his name and moved to rush to him, but Mizo and Mandalay held her back and warned her not to. All for One regarded Izuku with smug dismissal, making light of his threat. Izuku challenged him, driven by the sight of Ibra near tears and the Nomu still tangled in her vines. The vines proved astonishingly resilient, even withstanding a massive attack. Izuku ordered Ibra to run to Mandalay, and she complied, her vines breaking as she fled and freeing the Nomu. The Nomu lunged, swinging a massive hammer-like arm. Izuku dodged and tried to use the Dominator's touch to stop it, but All for One immediately sent a shockwave that struck him. Izuku barely held on, his middle-class regeneration quirk stabilizing him. The Nomu moved with impossible speed for its bulk, appearing behind Izuku and slamming him into the ground. It moved again with incredible swiftness, pinning him face down before yanking him upright to force him to look at All for One. All for One expressed disappointment and low expectations, but Izuku laughed in response and, in turn, displayed a sudden surge of power. He transformed into a rider once more, now surrounded by vivid green flames. The flames consumed the Nomu in a brilliant burst and defeated it. Though All for One's expression remained hidden behind his mask, Izuku sensed fear beneath the surface. A familiar voice rang in Izuku's head, warning that he could not maintain that form for long because its power was too great for him. All for One extended red, tendril-like appendages to grab Kurogiri and absorbed Kurogiri's quirk. Izuku charged at All for One, his chains slithering along the ground toward the masked man. As the chains were about to wrap around All for One, he warped himself and his companions away. Izuku clenched at the empty air where they had stood and screamed in frustration that he would find them and make them answer for All for One. Green flames swirled around Izuku like a furious tornado, engulfing the area nearby. Then everything went black as he collapsed into unconsciousness. Before he slipped fully away, he saw a green-haired figure running toward him. Izuku woke up to the sound of beeps. With his eyes closed, he tried to move and felt something cold on both his arms and legs. The restraints were Quirk-dampening cuffs securing him to the bed. When he opened his eyes, the bright light revealed a white ceiling and several medical appliances attached to him. Nizu entered and let him know that he was awake. Izuku asked calmly what Nizu wanted, maintaining his composure thanks to the control his gift from Lucifer had given him. Nizu accused him bitterly of faking his death, escaping Tartarus, turning the #1 hero against the staff, and killing almost 100 people. Izuku laughed for a long time and then told Nizu that he had not stolen anything and did not hate heroes. He insisted he had not faked his death and that the body Nizu had buried was not his. He said he had been pardoned. Nizu reacted angrily and denied the pardon, accusing Izuku of lying. Izuku shifted into the Ghost Rider form he had been given, noting that it did not count as a quirk. Nizu recoiled in shock and reached for the doorknob, only to find the door gone. Izuku used a surge of energy to pin Nizu to the wall and warned him that pride and stubbornness would not lead him anywhere good, asking if Nizu would listen. Nizu nodded shakily. Izuku then wrapped them both in a soft, blue flame-like aura. Nizu flinched but was not harmed. When the energy faded, the room was filled with officers, weapons raised and quirks activated, all startled by the sudden appearance. One officer tossed a quirk-dampening cuff toward Izuku and ordered him to wear it, but Izuku found the cuff ineffective and told them so while noting the fear turning to horror on their faces. He warned that if anyone tried to attack him he would stop them, then return to his normal form and carefully explained what had happened to him. Most did not believe until Izuku revealed private secrets and misdeeds that only they knew, which left them stunned and convinced. Izuku asked Nizu to release him. Nizu began to accuse him of killing people, but Izuku interrupted to clarify that he had not killed them. Instead, they were in a deep, irreversible coma. Nizu tried to argue that this was a condemnatory act, but Izuku cut him off and challenged him to call on greater powers if he wished to continue the argument. No one stopped Izuku as he walked out of the hospital. He stepped outside, summoned his motorcycle, and found it to be alive to the touch, its surface pulsing softly. He asked the bike to take him home, and it responded, revving and moving toward his old residence. Night had fallen when Izuku arrived. The living room lights were on and 3 silhouettes were visible inside, one thin figure pacing while the other 2 held their faces in their hands. As Izuku approached the door, he noticed an old friend in a black suit standing in the corner, accompanied by a man in white. Izuku bowed politely to Lucifer and then understood that the man in white was Gabriel. He recalled that these beings could read minds and that Gabriel had come simply to check on him. Gabriel assured him that he had done nothing wrong, and Lucifer said that they must go and wished him luck before both figures faded into the shadows. Izuku turned back to the door, knocked 3 times, and the door opened to reveal his father. Izuku greeted his father with a polite good evening. Toshinori went wide-eyed when Izuku appeared at the front door. Izuku looked different from before, taller, his usually bright face sharper, his build athletic. He entered his old home and looked around. Nothing seemed to have changed. Inko called from the living room, asking Yagi who was at the door. Toshinori opened his mouth but could not speak, so Izuku identified himself as Izuku Midorya. He still used his birth surname because he felt estranged from the family. Toshinori, also known as All Might, was his stepfather. Inko and Izumi rushed to the front door and stared at Izuku in shock. Izuku walked through the house while his parents and sisters stood frozen, unable to speak. He observed that the place looked the same, and his remarks seemed to draw Inko out of her trance. Inko asked, with tears in her eyes, if it was really him. Izuku confirmed with a small smile. Inko hurried forward and hugged him, crying. Izumi hesitated as if she wanted to run to him. Izuku opened his arms and invited her to embrace him. She rushed forward and hugged him tightly. It had been 4 days since they had buried Izuku. Inko sobbed harder than ever and demanded to know why he was still alive and where he had been. Izuku released his mother and sister and asked them to sit down. After a brief explanation, Inko became hysterical when she heard what he had endured in Tartarus. She questioned why anyone would do such things to her son. Izuku told her not to call him son. Izumi insisted she would confront Nizu, but Izuku told her to stop. Tashinori protested that he had tried to tell Nizu their son was innocent. Izuku's expression hardened and he glowed with a blue flame as he told them they had lost their son years ago when he had been labeled Quirkless, and that he was no longer their son but a stranger. Izumi began to plead. Izuku told her not to say please. He said he had already forgiven her but warned that they had blood on their hands. He turned to leave. Tashinori transformed, stepping into his all-might presence to plead that they had only acted to protect Izuku. Izuku stopped and turned back, his flames shifting to red and chains coiling around his arm. He accused Tashinori of protecting his own reputation by hiding him away, of neglecting and favoring Izumi, and of allowing Izumi to bully him until she forced him to attempt to take his life many times as a child. Tashinori bowed his head in shame. Inko glared at Izumi, and Izumi covered her face, crying. Izuku continued, reminding them that Tashinori watched his daughter with anger while forgetting he had made his son endure a miserable life. He asked if they knew what it felt like to cook for oneself at 4 years old, to eat whatever hunger allowed. He told them he had been denied proper food and small joys, and that they had used the pretense of protection as an excuse. He left his family stunned. Izuku drove to an old abandoned house where he had been staying. From the outside it looked worn and neglected, but inside it was surprisingly clean and comfortable. With Lucifer's help he had a place to stay. He was about to rest when someone knocked at the door. He sighed, irritated that someone had followed him and that the person did not come alone. He opened the door and demanded to know what Nizu wanted this time. Nizu replied that he wanted Izuku at UA. Izuku asked why he should accept. Nizu reminded him of his old dream to become a hero. Izuku admitted that the dream had faded after being pressured by his father and accused Nizu of not really wanting him there. Nizu conceded that he did not want Izuku at UA, but argued it was necessary to keep an eye on the rider and prevent mayhem. He presented Izuku with a letter detailing admission to UA. Izuku noticed he would be placed in Class 1A, the same room as Izumi and her friends. He said he was intrigued by Ibra in Class 1B and asked if he could visit her occasionally. Nizu hesitated but proposed a bargain. If Izuku joined UA and gave up his vigilante activities, Nizu would allow those visits. Izuku agreed and extended his hand. Nizu hesitated, then shook it. They reached an understanding. As Nizu prepared to leave, Izuku asked about Bakugo and offered to help find him. Nizu refused. He insisted the heroes should handle that work and that Izuku should remain at UA. Izuku nodded and opened the door for Nizu as a sign of respect. Nizu smiled and departed. Tomorrow promised to be an important day. The next day, Aizawa told his class to settle down and announced that he had surprising news. Class representatives spoke up, asking if it concerned Bakugo or the camping trip, but Aizawa shot down both guesses in a bored tone and warned them not to be disruptive. The whole class fell silent, waiting for the announcement. Aizawa observed the quiet with a measure of relief. Aizawa informed the class that they had a new classmate that day. The announcement sent the room into an uproar. Lita loudly protested that a new student in the middle of the semester was outrageous, and Mineta reacted excitedly. Aizawa used his capture gear to restrain Mineta briefly and told Lita to be quiet and sit down. Once the class had calmed, Aizawa called the new student in. Izuku entered and smiled at the shocked faces around him. Mineta panicked, thinking someone who had been presumed gone had returned. As Izuku began to speak, Lita demanded to know why he was there, but Izuku interrupted and put a finger to his lips. Lita fell silent and for a moment felt disoriented, seeing only a faint green light in the distance. She returned to awareness as Izuku finished speaking and took a seat at the back of the room. Aizawa instructed Izuku to change into his gym uniform and meet the class on the field to assess the strength of his quirk. Aizawa stepped into the circle and handed Izuku a ball that looked rubber but felt far heavier than it should, as if metal lay hidden inside. Aizawa instructed Izuku to use his quirk and throw the ball as hard as he could. Izuku hesitated, worried he might cause damage to the school, and Aizawa reassured him that the school would handle any costs. Izuku smiled, shifted into his rider form, and activated enhanced strength along with the Dominator's touch and his eternal flames. A gust of wind swirled around him as he focused all his power into the small sphere. He stretched his arm and unleashed the throw with everything he had. The blast broke the sound barrier and sent a shock that shattered the academy's windows. Classmates dropped to the floor and students in other rooms pressed back from the flying glass. Izuku offered Aizawa an apologetic smile. When the class recovered and stood, they could barely form words. Aizawa stared at his monitor, astonished. The only person who had matched that score before was Uraraka, but Izuku had achieved the infinite score as well because he had not deactivated the Dominator's touch and it had continued to register until it was out of range. The students gaped at Izuku in amazement while Shoto watched with visible anger. Aizawa continued the other evaluations, and by the end of the first day Izuku had broken every previous record. The entire class, Aizawa, and even Nizu watching through the cameras were stunned. Aizawa cleared his throat, told Izuku to change into his school uniform, and sent the rest of the students back to their classroom because he needed to speak with the principal. In the hallway, Mina approached Izumi, stars in her eyes, and asked if the man they had just seen was her brother, since they had thought they saw a burial days before. Mineta blurted that it must be a zombie, and Ida admonished him, insisting it was clearly a living person. Momo raised her voice so everyone could hear and reminded them that when Izumi had introduced herself she had said the man only resembled her brother and that they were not related. Izumi struggled to hold back her tears, not noticing that Shoto was watching her. Anger toward Izuku simmered in Shoto, and he spoke up, accusing Izuku of resenting them after being quirkless years ago and of letting that jealousy poison him. Shoto said they had been forced to physically restrain the boy at times, and that attempts to comfort him had sometimes been met with angry outbursts. A student in the back urged Shoto to continue, and the room fell silent as everyone listened. Shoto turned around shaking as warm hands settled on his shoulders. Izuku urged Shoto to continue his stories. Shoto tried to activate his quirk but found himself gasping as Izuku seized him by the throat and lifted him into the air. Izuku declared that he had come for Shoto, dragged him before the class, and slammed him down onto the teacher's desk, warping the wood with the force of the impact. Izuku grabbed Shoto's hair and forced him to face the frightened students. When Shoto remained silent, Izuku wrapped chains around his waist. The chains radiated a phantom heat that caused Shoto intense, supernatural pain without leaving visible wounds. The phantom flame liked his skin, causing agony that felt as if it reached deep into him while he remained painfully conscious. Mizo objected first, protesting Izuku's behavior, but Izuku coldly ordered him to be quiet and insisted he would make Shoto confess. Under pressure and in obvious distress, Shoto admitted that he had lied. He confessed that he had harbored hatred since childhood, that he had stood in the way of Izumi, and that he had been glad when he thought Shoto had no quirk. In a shaking, broken voice, Shoto apologized for bullying him when he had seemed defenseless and for forcing him toward despair during their youth. The phantom heat intensified and memories came crashing back. The searing sting of being scalded by his mother, the sharp fear in his eye as old wounds returned in his mind, the recollection of his father's blows and the helplessness of a young boy taking the punishment. The sensations were overwhelming, but they remained non-graphic memories of pain and fear rather than torn flesh. Then it stopped. The chains slackened and clattered to the classroom floor, and Izuku's grip loosened. Shoto collapsed to the ground and vomited. When he looked down he found his body unmarked. His classmates stared, some with disgust, others with pity. Mineta and others looked unsettled. Izuku declared that Shoto had been redeemed and forgiven, then placed the ashen-faced boy back in his seat. He told Shoto that the opportunity to make amends had been wasted, shook his head in disappointment at his sister, and left the room. Outside the classroom, Izuku returned to his human form and found Ibra standing in the doorway. She appeared about to knock, hesitated, and said she felt that something was wrong. Izuku found her concern endearing. When Ibra asked what he meant, Izuku admitted that he had forced one of the liars to be honest. He explained that he had given his former bully a chance at redemption and insisted that the boy had not been physically harmed in the long term. Ibra reacted with alarm, insisting that the Lord did not tolerate sinners and that chaos and bloodshed would bring only trouble. Izuku agreed that chaos was troubling and noted that it already lingered in their world. He laughed and led Ibra up to the roof. On the roof, Izuku released her hand and gestured toward the view. Ibra hesitated but then looked out over the trees, the sunny meadows, and the city beyond. Izuku asked if she could see the sight to behold and closed his eyes as he took in the day. A soft breeze lifted Ibra's hair and she watched him with quiet curiosity. Izuku told her that in every rainbow there is an end, and that end can be a beginning. He spoke of how, when he once thought something had ended, he found a new start, and he believed she would find the same. He warned that beneath every beautiful scene there can be a darker side that remains unseen. Ibra considered his words, understanding that there was a deeper meaning beneath them. Izuku left her on the roof to enjoy the view and smiled when she turned to gaze into the distance. She breathed in the breeze, smiled, and opened her arms to the day they had been given. For now, she would believe in the goodness she saw in others. In time she might learn that behind many faces there were hidden scars and false fronts, but until then she would live with the hopeful conviction that people could be good. School had just ended and the sun was setting. Aizawa announced that they would be living in a dormitory for the rest of the school year. Izuku disliked the idea. He would be surrounded by people he did not particularly like, and worse, he would no longer be able to do his daily patrols. Rode home on a summon bike. As he passed many dark alleys, he felt a small tingle at the back of his neck when he went by one of them. He recognized a familiar scent coming from that alley. He turned his bike around and slowly drove back. Through the narrow passage he saw a small bar-like shack. He sensed that Katsuki was inside that shack, and that Shigaraki, Toga, and Dabi were there as well. He also detected 3 more bodies underground twice, Mr. Compress and Kurojiri lying in a coma after what felt like a cleansing of their souls. Izuku walked away, deciding to let Nizu discover them. The principal had been so eager to prove they could save Katsuki on their own. At home, Izumi burst into tears when her mother arrived from school. Izumi told her mother that she had blown her chance with Izuku and sobbed into her arms. Inko held her daughter and patted her head, assuring her that another chance would come and that Izuku would forgive them. Inko told her to prepare her things early because UA would be implementing the dorm system next week. Yagi was not home. He was busy searching for Katsuki and had been unable to sleep, worried about the situation between Izuku and Bakugo. Inko was worried for her family and covered her eyes, hoping that a new day would come when they could smile again. In the meeting room, Nizu slapped a stack of papers on the table and explained that the League of Villains had gone on strong defense ever since young Midoriya had neutralized their essential asset, Kurojiri. Nizu then addressed Aizawa and asked if he had any leads. Aizawa reported that he had been tracking Toga, who was attempting to conceal herself in public but had been caught on images sneaking into blood banks. He showed a photograph of Toga in a blue hoodie and a face mask. Midnight asked whether he had followed her, and Aizawa nodded, passing along photos of the bar-like shack in the alleyway. Nizu said he believed that was where Bakugo was being held. He explained that he had hired someone from the police force with a thermal quirk who confirmed a high level of heat in the building. Empty Lady asked how they would approach the situation. Aizawa instructed them not to worry about Bakugo directly and said their priority should be destroying the Nomu factory. It was essential that the factory be taken down. Empty Lady acknowledged the order. Kamui Woods asked whether Endeavor would be joining the operation. Nizu confirmed that Endeavor would join, along with Best Jeanist and Gang Orca, to provide backup in case the League's leader appeared. Nizu credited young Izuku for diminishing the odds of the leader's involvement. The operation was set to begin the next day. Far below, in a darker realm, a man in black armor reported nervously to an older man in a suit that many Dmed souls had escaped and were heading toward the mortal world, with hundreds gathered at a single point. The armored subordinate said it would be catastrophic if those soulless beings managed to inhabit bodies. The older man, Lucifer, listened and assured his subordinate, Abaddon, that a failsafe was already in place. Abaddon bowed and left to continue his duties. Lucifer looked upward into the non-existent ceiling and told his rider to protect the innocent. Izuku Midorya watched from afar as a pro-hero dressed like a pizza deliverman knocked on the door of the lonely shack. He wanted to act, but he decided to observe for the moment. When the door opened, the heroes immediately restrained the remaining villains. Bakugo relaxed at the sight of All Might. Izuku felt disappointment when the heroes inside the shack did not respond to the police officer's cries as a group of Nomus emerged through a portal that once had been Kurogiri's quirk. Izuku felt he should help. He put a finger to his lips and whistled a short, sharp note. His motorcycle, as if alive, drove toward him and stopped beside the now flaming young man. Izuku felt alert. The Nomus seemed like lower-tier threats, but he had a sense that something far worse than All for One was approaching and fast. Chains wrapped around Izuku's arm unraveled and lashed out, binding the Nomus before they could reach the police. He prepared to incinerate one when it twitched, the chains broke, and pieces fell away. He was stunned. No one should be able to break those chains. The Nomu lay in pieces and then suddenly stilled, as if rebooting. It scanned its surroundings and then fixed its gaze on Izuku. The Nomu identified him as Rider. Izuku did not know what to make of that, so he rushed forward and struck the Nomu to send it flying. The Nomu withstood the attack and responded with a blow to Izuku's head. Its strength rivaled All Might's in his prime. They exchanged blows, and fissures formed in the ground as shockwaves rippled outward, alerting the heroes inside the shack. Gran Torino was the first to appear, and what he saw made him freeze. Nomus were fighting, and one was locked in combat with the feared Rider. From the shockwaves, it was clear the Nomu's strength rivaled All Might's. Izuku seized the Nomu by the arm and snapped it off. The limb fell limp, as if the creature lacked regenerative abilities. He clenched his fists and let the cursed flames dance across the Rider's arm. His final strike sent the Nomu collapsing, its form consumed by flame until it crumpled. Other Nomus on the ground twitched, then fell and shook, emitting eerie keening sounds. Lucifer spoke into Izuku's mind, explaining that the souls of the Dmed he had been watching over had escaped and were inhabiting empty shells, the Nomus. If those shells were occupied, they would gain immense strength. Lucifer asked the Rider to destroy every last one before his voice faded. Midorya, frantic, wondered what was happening and called for Lucifer, but there was no answer. He took a fighting stance and shouted to everyone within earshot, ordering them to destroy the Nomus and warning that the souls of the Dmed were using the bodies as temporary vessels and would wreak havoc if left unchecked. Many hesitated, but Endeavor ignited and began incinerating the Nomus he could reach. In frustration, Endeavor urged the others to act and follow the boy's warning. The crowd, frightened into motion, began to fight back. A distant scream echoed from the left side of the battlefield. One Nomu was cutting a path of destruction. Bullets and damage-based quirks barely affected it. More Nomus were becoming vessels for the Dmed. Izuku tore through those still twitching on the ground, but 6 Nomus had already been possessed. He braced for a major confrontation, then heard an explosion far off from where he stood and wondered what else the day would bring. Destruction spread across the city. Nomus rampaged, and many lives were lost in the chaos. But amid the ruin, a fiery figure continued to battle, striking down Nomus with searing assaults and a new scythe forged from cursed flame and metal. The weapon glowed green and burned with an intense heat, wielded by the Rider like a beacon in the disaster. All around, enemies and former rivals fought together against the immediate threat. Villains and heroes set aside differences to stop the Nomus from overwhelming the city. Dabi burned down approaching Nomus, and Shigaraki disintegrated those that had been incapacitated. All for One fought alongside All Might, their hostility replaced by a shared urgency to keep the world from collapsing. All Might called out observations about the Nomus abilities, noting multiple spring-like arms, earth manipulation, and fire manipulation among them. He warned All for One that more Nomus were coming from the right while trying to hold down 3 at once. He followed by unleashing United States of Smash, sending several Nomus crashing into ruined buildings where they became pinned by twisted metal and debris. Smoke wreaths rose from All Might as his exhausted form began to falter. All for One noticed the change and struck at All Might's exposed side with a powerful, targeted attack. All Might staggered under the blow, barely able to stand, and All for One warned him not to speak so it would be easier to tend to him. Meanwhile, the students of UA did their best to protect civilians. An ivy-haired student used her quirk to hold off Nomu and shield those nearby, doing everything she could to keep people safe as the battle raged on. Ibra had a head wound and her arms were injured from the impact. Flashback. Tsuyu asked the rest of Class 1A where Izumi and Shoto had gone. They were looking for their friends who had suddenly disappeared along with Ida and Yayarozu. They went searching when they saw Ibra nearby. Mina called to Ibra enthusiastically and waved, but Ibra ignored her and kept walking. Mina approached Ibra and asked what she was doing. Ibra coldly said it was none of her business. Mina protested that they were friends, and Ibra insisted she preferred the word acquaintance. Seeing the rest of Class 1A, Ibra tried to walk away, annoyed, and asked if anyone had seen a green-haired girl and a half-white, half-red-haired boy pass by. She shook her head when they all answered no. Mineta suggested a robotic Four Eyes and a rich girl, which earned him a quick slap on the head from Kirishima. Ibra then realized there were more missing students than just 4 and asked about Izuku, wondering if he was missing too. Tsuyu replied that Izuku did not really hang out with them and often disappeared, so his absence did not necessarily mean something was wrong. Ibra clenched her fists. If Izuku was not here and students were missing, something was definitely wrong. A huge explosion sounded nearby. Ibra whispered that she had been right. Kaminari, voice trembling, asked what she meant and suggested Izuku might be up to something. Ibra cut him off and used her vines to pull her classmates close, forming a protective dome. Time seemed to slow as 6 Nomu rushed toward them and a building hurtled in their direction. Ibra used her vines to shield everyone from the collapsing structure, but a Nomu was directly in front of her. She braced herself with her arms and vines. The combined impact left her arms injured and damaged her vines. In a flashback, Kirishima lay among the rubble, seriously injured and barely breathing. Mina used her quirk to dissolve sections of the damaged building and free trapped civilians, while Mineta used his quirk to secure debris and prevent further collapse. Ibra was close to collapsing, and Kaminari and Tsuyu could offer little against a Nomu this powerful. Uraraka used her quirk to lighten Ibra and keep her from falling, and Achiko smiled and reassured them that they would get through this. Ibra sighed and resolved to defeat the creature and find Izuku. Kaminari asked why Izuku. Ibra answered that she was certain he knew what was happening here. A Nomu launched a barrage of attacks at Ibra. Tsuyu used her tongue to pull her clear, aided by the fact that Uraraka had lightened Ibra. Izuku held the sleeping Ibra close to his chest. Izuku asked the Nomu why it was here. The Nomu replied that it had come to free itself from its prison. The sky lit up red and rain began to pour, accentuating the flames that surrounded everything. Izuku asked if the Nomu truly thought this place was its prison. The Nomu insisted it had been made to pay debts but vowed not to be defeated even by the devil himself. Izuku laughed and set Ibra gently on the ground, enclosing her in a ring of protective, eternal flames. He then kicked a boulder at the Nomu with overwhelming force. The Nomu blocked the boulder, smashing it to pieces and losing sight of Izuku for a moment. A fist struck one of the Nomu, knocking it down. The fallen Nomu screeched for its comrades to attack the rider and kill him. The Nomu answered by punching Izuku, forcing him to cough up blood as its blow connected with the now human rider. 13 Nomu arrived and swarmed Izuku without hesitation, overwhelming him with a brutal barrage that left him battered and unable to retaliate. They continued until 2 enormous blasts sent them flying away from the bloodied, green-haired boy. All Might rushed to Izuku and cradled him, calling his name desperately. All for One told All Might that it was not the time, but All Might ignored him and pleaded for help, begging All for One to heal Izuku. All for One shook his head and said he could heal wounds but that the boy was in a much worse condition. All for One then faced the Nomu and announced himself as their creator, declaring that he had made them to reshape the world, not to destroy it. He told them that now he might have to destroy what he had created. One Nomu jeered and asked whether the creation or the creator would prevail. All for One was not amused. He left All Might to hold the broken boy and urged All Might to hurry and not give up. All for One sent a shockwave that blasted 2 unprepared Nomu away while the rest held their ground, snarling at their new opponent. All Might begged Izuku to wake as rain fell on the boy's face, causing Izuku to twitch and then open his eyes too. The crying All Might. Izuku laughed weakly and embraced All Might, telling him that he had only tested whether he could forgive him. All Might asked quietly if he had passed, and Izuku, holding him tightly, said that he had. All for One screamed for All Might, and the two turned to see him surrounded by Nomu. The Nomu circled All for One like predators, forcing him into a tense, dangerous position. Izuku whistled, which forced the Nomu to halt their circling. Izuku asked the Nomu if they truly thought they had bested him in combat and challenged their claim that the world was a prison. Izuku then transformed into an emerald green rider. Chains multiplied around him and flames rose from the ground. From above, dozens of small blades descended and linked themselves to the chains in a spectacle of ominous light and shadow. Izuku declared that this life was his sentence and his destiny, that he had bled and endured terrible things for it, and that he would not be defined only as a disaster. Izuku grew taller, towering over the Nomu, who trembled before him. One Nomu stammered that he was also a prisoner of war, born to fight. Izuku accepted the challenge and launched himself at the Nomu. The Nomu answered to let the gods know their will and charged toward the rider. The chains, now tipped with blades, spun like serpents, striking at the Nomu in stylized bursts of force. Some Nomu fell back while others were struck down and collapsed, their forms dissipating as if banished from the battlefield. The energy of the attacks swept the defeated Nomu away without graphic detail. Meanwhile, All for One and All Might fought to hold back the remaining Nomu. All for One used long-range quirks to maintain distance, while All Might engaged in close-quarters combat. The Nomu exhibited strength comparable to All Might in his prime, making the clashes fierce. Experience gave All Might an edge, but a second Nomu landed a blow that missed his head by inches. Izuku threw Nomu aside with overwhelming force, blades slicing through them in flashes of energy. The assaults left the battlefield littered with immobilized constructs and dissipated energies, the ground scarred by the intensity of the conflict. The Emerald Rider tore through the Nomus, striking the ground with such force that the earth split and molten energy surged up, fueling him further. Only 2 Nomus remained, the rest had been sent back to whatever shadow they had come from. All for One, seeing the Nomus handled, decided his assistance was no longer needed and vanished with the rest of the League of Villains using their rap quirk. Ibra woke sore and with aching arms. She raised her head and saw the towering rider. Emerald flames washed over her like a comforting warmth that made her feel protected. She smiled, relieved to think he was more guardian than monster. Izuku noticed her and said that it would be over soon. His blades clashed and merged into a single long, broad weapon, shining gold and wreathed in radiant light. He invoked the command "Witness the might of the Seraphim" and executed a sweeping motion that overwhelmed the remaining Nomus, sending them flying in a brilliant arc and bathing the land in a soft warmth that helped the injured and honored the fallen. The red sky dispersed and a bright new dawn arrived. Ibra stood as her arms finished healing and rushed toward Izuku, who had returned to his human form, then embraced him. Ibra told him that he truly was an angel, and Izuku flushed with surprise and gentle embarrassment. All Might appeared to Izuku's left, wearing his familiar encouraging smile. All Might instructed him to raise his hand in triumph and reminded him that the cameras were watching, that they needed to show everyone they had won. Izuku leaned toward Ibra and asked if they could spend time together afterward. Ibra blushed, closed her eyes, and silently hoped she had not imagined it. He laughed and raised his hand as distant roars and cheers rose across the city. A new dawn had arrived. Lucifer turned to a man with violet hair and red eyes and said that the deed had been done. The man confirmed that it had. Lucifer asked how he had known the boy would be the chosen one. The man explained that, across many universes and timelines, the boy with that smile always appeared. Lucifer thanked him for choosing to save this world by convincing the world's god and Lucifer himself to take part, and then extended his hand. Zack Necropolis met Lucifer's gaze with a blank stare, took the offered hand, and shook it. Zack said the pleasure was his and excused himself, explaining that more timelines needed saving, then waved as he began to walk away. A rift opened and a figure appeared within. Lucifer observed that the figure resembled Izuku but with yellow hair and a yellow suit, appearing as a being of chaos. Zack stepped through the portal and, before it closed, Lucifer heard him declare that it was time to stop this nonsense addressed to Izuku Cypher. Kaminari used his support gear to fire his pointers. The discs stuck to their points of impact, and as long as Kaminari remained within 10 meters of a target, he could draw his electric discharges to any pointer he chose, concentrating the charge into a straight line. His attack only paralyzed the Nomu for a moment before the creature drove a punch into his stomach, sending him to his hands and knees, gasping for air. Toru, who remained effectively invisible to the Nomu, activated warp refraction and emitted a bright light. She seized the chance to grab Kaminari and pull him to safety. Aoyama followed with his naval laser, striking the Nomu and incapacitating it. Aoyama vomited at the aftermath. Achiko reassured Aoyama that he had done the right thing and saved them all, but he still felt shaken. Jiro plugged her earphone jack into the ground and immediately sensed something. She widened her eyes when she spotted another Nomu barreling toward them at high speed. The group realized they had to retreat immediately. Shiro used his tapes to gather the civilians and the still unconscious Kirishima. Achiko used her quirk to make it easier for Shiro to carry everyone to safety. Ojiro smashed aside anything that might obstruct their path. Tokoyami, struggling to control his dark shadow, still did his best to run with civilians on his back. Ibra could not move without risking a collapse of the building above her that would endanger Class 1A and the civilians. Mineta did his best to support Ibra in whatever way he could, while Tsuyu held Ibra up and tried to staunch the bleeding from her forehead. The Nomu crashed onto the scene with a thunderous impact that almost sent rubble down onto Ibra and the others. The creature emitted a low, gurgling call, labeling them prey. Tsuyu pleaded with Ibra to let go, but Ibra shook her head and explained that if she did, they would all die. She urged them to go on without her, saying she believed she would be protected. Mineta grabbed Tsuyu and pushed her to run. Tsuyu tried to go back to Ibra, but vines wrapped around the waists of both her and Mineta and held them together. Mineta ran with Tsuyu struggling behind him, exhausted but insisting that they could not lose the chance Ibra had given them. Tsuyu cried out, praying for anyone who would listen to send help for Ibra. A flaming chain suddenly lashed out and ensnared the Nomu, throwing it back onto the pavement. Izuku arrived, his coat torn and his head showing signs of recent injury. He complained about the dent on his head and muttered that he needed to take better care of himself. He charged the Nomu, pinned it to the ground, and unleashed a rapid barrage of powerful, fiery punches. The Nomu tried to fight back but was quickly overwhelmed by Izuku's speed and strength. Izuku's strikes came so fast they blurred. The Nomu was consumed by flames and collapsed into burning debris. Izuku stood and turned toward Ibra. He saw that her arms were badly injured and that she had a wound on her forehead. He shifted back to his human form and walked over to her, reassuring her that everything would be all right and asking if she wanted to know why. He used his chains to pull the rubble off her, prompting her vines to retract, and she fell into his waiting arms. Izuku told her that she was safe because he was there. A small white-haired girl wrapped in bandages with a small horn on the side of her forehead ran through a dark alley, trying to escape a man whose face was hidden behind a beak-shaped mask. She pushed herself forward, desperate to get away, and then she saw a light at the end of the path. Izuku wore a black hoodie, blue pants, and red sneakers. Beside him walked a green ivy-haired girl named Ibra. They kept some distance between them, each trying to mind their own space as they watched people rebuild the damaged city. Ibra smiled at the tired but genuine expressions on the faces of those who had gathered in the sunlight of the new day. The city was slowly moving past the horrors of 2 days earlier. Although many tears had been shed, 156 unnamed heroes had died protecting civilians, and 1,357 unnamed civilians had perished in the chaos that had swept across Japan. All Might still held the title of #1 hero, his wound having been healed by the villain known as All for One, who had vanished without a trace after the battle. Endeavor had returned to hero work despite injuries that would leave him with lasting scars and bruises, and he had been back on duty as soon as the Nomu were neutralized. The rescue mission had succeeded in bringing Bakugo back. The rest of Class 1A bore their own wounds but were alive. Izumi, Shoto, Ida, and Yaoyorozu had been commended for protecting civilians during the Nomu attack. School remained on hold while many teachers helped with recovery efforts. Izuku asked Ibra what they should do now. He sounded uncertain and found it hard to form the sentence. Ibra smiled at his nervousness and found it endearing. A sudden small collision sounded behind them. Ibra turned and saw the white-haired child tumble to the ground with a muffled grunt. Ibra moved quickly to the girl and asked if she was all right, assuring her that she meant no harm. The child's fear eased at Ibra's gentle tone. Ibra helped the girl to her feet and, noticing the bandages, asked in a firmer voice whether she was hurt and why she wore them. A man with a beak-shaped mask stepped forward and demanded his daughter back. Ibra asked him who he was, cautious. The man replied that his name was no one's concern and insisted on taking the child. Ibra positioned herself between the man and the girl. Izuku asked why the child was bandaged. The man explained that the child, Eri, was prone to accidents and that the bandages covered bruises, then made a movement as if to remove his gloves. Eri suddenly ran to the masked man and took his hands, apologizing quietly while keeping her gaze lowered. The man said nothing further and began to walk away. Before the man left, Eri looked directly at Ibra and mouthed a plea for help. Ibra's eyes widened and she moved to respond, but Izuku squeezed her hand and leaned in close to whisper that they could not act there and then. He explained that the masked man was dangerous and that any scene in broad daylight would likely panic nearby civilians, who might mistake the disturbance for another Nomu attack. Ibra hesitated, imagining the frightened faces of bystanders, and reluctantly agreed that a public confrontation would be unwise. Ibra asked Izuku to promise that he would save the girl. Izuku, seeing the determination in her tear-filled eyes, promised that he would find a way to help Eri. Later, Izuku entered the principal's office and found Nizu occupied with a new security detail that a man named Cypher had implemented. Nizu greeted Izuku and asked what had brought him to the office. Izuku asked Nizu if he knew anything about a man with a beak-like gas mask. Nizu responded that he meant Overhaul and that Izuku need not be so formal, since he probably already knew. Izuku chuckled, closed the door, and explained to Nizu about Eri and how he and Ibra had found her wrapped in bandages. Nizu considered the information and identified the girl's quirk as rewind. He spun in his chair and said they already planned to raid the Yakuza and rescue her, so there was no need to worry. Izuku gripped Nizu's chair and forced him to meet his eyes, warning quietly about the danger the girl posed. Nizu shook his head, surprised as Izuku explained that Eri's quirk could rewind anything she touched, even the molecular structure of quirks themselves, potentially erasing them entirely. Nizu's eyes widened and he immediately began contacting other heroes. After a thoughtful pause, Nizu wondered if the quirk might also be able to restore someone to human form. Izuku said that was a possibility. Izuku left the office and went to his class, expecting a certain blonde to be ranting at their classmates. He found Bakugo shouting at others while Shoto grabbed him by the collar, insisting that if they had not intervened during the Nomu incident, Bakugo would have died. Bakugo snapped back and unleashed an explosive blast at close range, forcing the class to react. The rest of Class 1A restrained both students while Ida reprimanded them for behaving unreasonably and warned Shoto not to escalate things further. Bakugo continued to hurl insults. Yaoyorozu moved to calm Shoto while Izumi used her quirk to keep Bakugo's hands from aiming at anyone, and Mineta used his ability to pin Bakugo's arms to his sides. A loud bang announced Izuku's return. He stood in the doorway, visibly tense, and told them to act their age and stop the fighting. The class quieted immediately, but Bakugo lunged toward Izuku. His arms were immobilized, and Mina reacted by slapping him, which knocked him to the floor. The room fell silent as Mina, tearful and shaken, accused Bakugo of having gone too far and reminded everyone that if Izuku had not been there, things could have been much worse. Yaoyorozu moved to comfort her. Bakugo rose and shouted at Mina, then ran at her and struck her in the torso. The class rushed to defend Mina. Kirishima punched Bakugo in the face, his quirk hardening, adding force to the blow. He trembled at having hit his friend and begged him to stop. Bakugo continued to shout that they were all worthless and tried to provoke the others. Izuku seized Bakugo by the hair and forced him to meet his gaze, his expression cold and determined. Izuku told Bakugo that the problem did not lie with the others but with him, and warned that if he repeated this behavior there would be serious consequences for both him and his quirk. Izuku released the trembling blonde and, with a calmer smile, instructed everyone to return to their seats. Bakugo was walking through the hallway. A few hours earlier he had been kicked out after another outburst. Aizawa had wrapped him in his capture gear and thrown him out of the room. Bakugo shouted that they were all pieces of garbage before the door clicked shut. He muttered that they were all assholes as he got up and decided to vent his anger by walking. Izumi wondered what was going on with Bakugo. He seemed more hostile than before. His pride had been getting out of hand. She listened to the rest of Aizawa's class and resolved to confront Bakugo afterward. Izuku warned her not to go, explaining that it would only make matters worse. Izumi insisted that Bakugo was her friend and would listen to her. Izuku sighed deeply and tapped her shoulder to get her attention, but she ignored him. Later, while Izumi packed her books, Izuku observed her leave the classroom and decided to follow her without her knowing. Unlike years ago, Bakugo was now unstable, and Izuku was worried. He followed silently through UA's deserted halls, looking for any sign of the angry blonde. Izumi found Bakugo sitting underneath the stairs. From Izuku's vantage point behind a wall, Bakugo looked extremely sad, veins standing out on his temple. Izumi told Bakugo to go home. Bakugo exploded at her, telling her to get lost and lashing out at Izuku, accusing him of being useless and everyone of treating him like a hero. Izumi responded calmly but firmly that she cared about both of them. A burly, bearded man in a brown coat descended the stairs, hearing the argument. He introduced himself as Hagrid and said he was a pro-hero, though he mentioned a quirky online handle he sometimes used. Izumi noted the strange choice of name politely. Hagrid explained that his quirk had a disorienting effect on people that could calm conflicts for a time. Bakugo dismissed him rudely, and Hagrid raised his hands and walked away, wearing a look of contempt. After Hagrid left, Bakugo suddenly grabbed Izumi. A tense struggle followed. Izuku intervened before anything further occurred. Izumi was shocked and frightened while she struggled, and Izuku acted quickly to separate them and restrain Bakugo. The confrontation escalated into a physical scuffle. Izuku pinned Bakugo against the wall and landed several solid blows, keeping the fight close and furious in an anime-like flurry of movement. Bakugo swore and fought back, his vision blurring as the exchange continued. He wondered if this was how it felt to be on the receiving end of his own aggression. Amid the struggle, a strange sensation overtook Bakugo. He felt an intense heat and pressure as if an unseen force were judging him. A spectral figure resembling a burning skull appeared, speaking in a voice that was cold and severe. The figure declared that killing Bakugo would be too easy and that a harsher lesson was required for someone consumed by pride and destructive impulses. Bakugo felt overwhelmed by the apparition's gaze. His strength faltered and panic rose within him as if his resolve were melting away. The spectral figure warned that the consequences of Bakugo's current path would be devastating, and it painted a grim vision of how his actions could impact those around him. The sensation of burning and weakening passed as the vision faded, leaving Bakugo shaken and trembling. Izuku kept Bakugo restrained until help arrived, ensuring Izumi was safe and steady. The encounter left all three students unsettled, their relationship strained but alive, and the warning from the mysterious figure hung in the air like a threat that demanded reflection. Nizu ordered the crying ash-blonde man to leave, his voice low and deadly. Bakugo Katsuki was on all fours, begging Nizu for another chance. Nizu avoided his eyes, and so did the rest of the teachers. Katsuki turned to his mother, Mitsuki, pleading for her belief. Mitsuki's face was contorted in anger and disgust. She had known her son to be difficult, but this was a shock to her and everyone who knew him. Mitsuki told Katsuki that he had fallen. Beside her, Izumi wiped her tears and refused to meet Katsuki's gaze, while Izuku remained unreadable. Nizu accused Katsuki of committing serious misconduct toward a fellow student in the school, and noted that the student was his childhood friend. Aizawa reminded the room that the same student had saved Katsuki when he had been kidnapped. Kirishima chastised Katsuki for his behavior. Nizu asked Izumi if she had anything to say. Izumi stated that Katsuki was no friend of hers and that she would not defend someone who had crossed the line. Katsuki's world shattered. He had strived to become a hero, and the accusation felt like a betrayal. Katsuki did not accept it calmly. He lunged toward Izumi, raising his hand to use his quirk, but the teachers held their ground. And Izumi remained composed, confident he could not reach her. Katsuki shouted that he was not a villain, but when he tried to activate his quirk, nothing happened. He attempted again, aiming at Nizu, but still nothing. He glanced at Aizawa, then at Nizu, who explained that something had interfered with his power. Katsuki rushed at Izuku, intent on attacking him, but Izuku seized his arm and threw him to the ground. Izuku told Katsuki to stop, calling him by his nickname with a small, controlled smirk. Katsuki demanded that his quirk be returned, but before he could act again, the world spun and he collapsed into unconsciousness. A bearded man in the corner of the room observed that the incident had been eventful. Midnight thanked the man for intervening. The bearded hero said he disliked violence and believed the situation would only worsen if left alone. He then carried Katsuki to the medical bay. When Katsuki came to, he found himself under a bright hospital light. Izuku sat nearby, reading the school newspaper. Katsuki saw the headline declaring a scandal involving a student from Class 1A and a serious incident with a fellow classmate. The paper reported that Izuku Midorya had intervened to protect that student and that Katsuki had been accused in the matter. Katsuki asked softly for his quirk back. Izuku replied that Katsuki did not deserve it right now, and reminded him of a series of harmful actions from his past before entering UA. Izuku placed the newspaper down beside Katsuki and, with a quiet comment about falling and rising again, left the room. Alone in the ward, Katsuki sat up, wiped his eyes, and picked up the newspaper. The article repeated that Izuku had acted to protect a fellow student during an incident involving Confronting Bakugo. It also stated that Principal Nizu had expelled Katsuki and that the pro-hero who intervened had temporarily removed the boy's quirk, saying that he had lost his way and needed guidance before he could be trusted again. Family and friends shielded themselves from reporters, but sources suggested they hoped Katsuki would return when he had recovered. Katsuki closed his eyes and drifted into sleep, promising himself he would make things right for his mother. Overhaul ran down scorched hallways, trying to escape. He passed incapacitated figures of his former comrades, their forms still in place but no longer fighting. A voice warned him not to run from what had come for him. He halted at the sight of a shadowy figure surrounded by flickering, otherworldly flames and wrapped in chains. Overhaul demanded how it had come to this. In a flashback, he remembered having used his quirk on Eri to alter her for his experiments. She had cried and suffered, but he had remained focused on his goals and his products. The world was corrupted by a power known as quirks, and he would do anything to stop it. He dismissed the so-called League of Villains as nobodies who had aided heroes only after their own creations failed, calling them pathetic. Overhaul told the little girl to stop crying and that it was annoying. The child, Eri, curled up and sobbed from pain. He ordered her not to show emotions, branding her a curse and saying she did not deserve human feelings. He left the room and locked the door, tossing the key toward one of his men in a bird mask. He instructed the henchman to make sure she could not escape, warning that failure would mean becoming his next test subject. The henchman agreed and stood guard at the door, trying to ignore the quiet whimpers beyond. In his office, Overhaul plotted to surprise the heroes, certain they would try to take Eri from him in the coming weeks. He summoned another man and told him to prepare bullets for when the fire alarm went off. Suddenly, a huge explosion erupted on the floor above. The possibility of the heroes arriving flashed through his mind. The soot-covered guard burst into the office, claiming the rider had arrived. Overhaul realized he had forgotten that threat. The guard reported that Eri had become very sad and that he had tried to comfort her. His laughter shifted into something strained as flames unexpectedly engulfed him and he collapsed, the attack leaving him incapacitated in a sudden, unnatural blaze. Overhaul dashed from his office, avoiding scorching chains as he ran. From a distance, the rider called for a fleeting distraction while he manipulated the surroundings, pressing his hands to the stone and turning it into molten rock. The scene shifted into a memory of the rider's merciless approach. Overhaul could barely believe how things had deteriorated. The rider declared that Overhaul was to be cast down, invoking a harsh judgment for those who abused others. Overhaul screamed for the rider to stay away and slammed his bare hands onto the floor, unleashing a shockwave that produced jagged spikes beneath the rider. The strikes staggered the rider, and Overhaul forced the ground open to swallow him. Overhaul laughed at what he thought was the rider's end, but the floor soon gave way and the rider pulled himself up, his chains coiling with unnerving speed. The rider closed the distance, his chains wrapping around Overhaul and hauling him in. He spoke in a forceful, almost hymn-like voice about grace, faith, and consequence, declaring that Overhaul would pay for his sins and asserting his own strength like an unstoppable tide. With the rider's command, Overhaul was sent downward into a void, gone and never to return. Izuku offered his hand to Eri. She hesitated at first, but his calm kindness made her feel protected. She took his hand and walked through the flames as if they were nothing. He reassured her that feeling fear could be the source of courage and carried her into the sunlight, cradling her to shield her from the chaos. When heroes and officials arrived, Nizu rushed over in concern. Izuku explained that he had saved someone who needed help and that he acted because others had been delayed. He kept Eri close to shield her from the flashing lights until she fell into a weary sleep. He then excused himself and left, leaving Nizu concerned but amused. At home, Izuku introduced Eri to his sister, Izumi, asking her to care for the child while he handled work. Izumi immediately embraced the sleeping girl, comforting her. Izuku smiled at his sister's tenderness and returned to his duties. An hour into his work, Izuku felt a familiar presence and turned to see an old ally in black armor, the Vigilante known as Shadow Knight. The Vigilante greeted him warmly, and they shared a brief, nostalgic exchange about their last meeting years before. Their conversation was cut short by a scream from a nearby alley. Shadow Knight readied himself and said they would deal with the threat. They moved into the shadows together and found a woman in need of help. The attackers tried to flee, but were quickly restrained by a combination of shadowy binds and Izuku's controlled flames, leaving them unable to escape. One of the assailants pleaded for mercy as they were secured. Shadow Knight knocked the opponent out. Izuku had been about to use his penance stare when Shadow Knight stopped him and suggested they let the police handle the situation. Izuku asked why, and Shadow Knight explained that even the worst person could become good if they chose to try. Izuku chuckled and teased that a certain skeleton seemed to have dug deep into Shadow Knight's brain. Shadow Knight laughed and bid Izuku farewell. Later, Izuku knocked on his sister's door and called that he was there for Eri. His sister Izumi reluctantly opened and handed Eri to him. Izuku thanked his sister and asked Eri if she would like to meet her new family. Eri asked nervously if this was really family. Izuku took her hand and walked toward a restaurant where Ibra was waiting. Ibra startled when Izuku appeared and immediately dashed forward to hug Eri, exclaiming how cute she was. Izuku admitted that Ibra had surprised him, and Eri laughed. Izuku introduced Ibra as Eri's new mother. Ibra was stunned by the announcement. Eri hugged her new mother. Eri then asked who would be her father. Ibra blushed and immediately named Izuku. Izuku laughed and nodded when Eri asked if he would be her new father. He knelt down to speak with her and told Eri that there were things she must know. Even in the darkest times there is always a shimmer of hope, and whether help came from an angel or an unexpected source, both could do good as long as her heart stayed in the right place. He who had raised her from a tiny seed to a grown tree felt her heart beating like a precious thing, with eyes as charming as a fairy tale. He was fortunate enough to give her his unconditional love and to have her in his arms, filled with affection and care. He carried her in his heart and her future in his mind. His world lived in her eyes and his memories were filled with her smile and small, beloved moments. As a father he was joyful, but somewhere his hidden worries about her future battled with him. He felt he had conquered the world when his daughter first said Papa. That happiness felt like it could buy the whole universe. He always wanted her to hold his finger and go for walks, to feel the warmth of her small hand when she touched his face. He would drift into dreams with his princess, sharing never-ending tiny tales. It was their world of happiness and imagination. When she began walking, he supported her. When she began talking, he helped her find words. When she began recognizing people, he became her encyclopedia. When she began eating, he made sure she was nourished. He remained close, watching her every action with admiration. Izuku struggled to get her to open her heart. This is that story. Eri apologized to Izuku as he made breakfast for her. He did not know why she spoke that way, but when he saw tears on her face, he moved quickly to comfort her and held her gently in his arms, careful and loving as if protecting something fragile. She sobbed as she never had before in front of him, and he felt a new, unsettling fear. Izuku asked what was wrong, expecting something small, but Eri begged him not to leave and insisted she would not be a burden. Her words stirred painful memories of his own past, when his parents had ignored him and he had felt neglected. Eri continued to cry, unaware that she was the sweetest and most precious gift he had ever received. Her eyes, like his after years of hardship, were still full of questions. Izuku found the words to comfort her. He told her that she was like an angel sent to him, that when he looked at her he did not want to see her cry. He kissed her forehead, hugged her, and wiped away her tears, and his reassurance brought a small, innocent smile back to her face. Ibra watched them and felt something stir in her heart. Izuku told Eri that her mother was there and suggested they eat before going to Eri's new school. Eri nodded and ate with a smile. Afterward, Ibra dressed her in a new outfit and the little girl looked adorable. They walked to the school Izuku had once attended. Ibra stood in front of the gate and watched as Izuku guided Eri to the door and kissed her forehead before she went inside. Izuku then walked back to the gate where Ibra sat. Unable to stay silent, Ibra asked about a phrase she had heard him say when he said goodbye. He explained that the phrase, "I wish you enough," was a blessing passed down through generations by his parents, a wish for a life with just enough good to sustain someone. He recited the blessing to her in memory. He wished for enough sun to keep a bright attitude, enough rain to appreciate the sun, enough happiness to keep the spirit alive, enough pain so small joys appear larger, enough gain to satisfy wanting, enough loss to appreciate what one possesses, and enough hellos to get through the final goodbye. Ibra could not contain her feelings any longer. She reached for Izuku and gave him a brief, heartfelt kiss. Izuku was surprised at first but soon returned her affection. Ibra laughed and told him he was the perfect man for her, that seeing him had made her heart flutter and his actions that day had confirmed her feelings. Izuku teased that she had not quite convinced him yet, smiled, and kissed her gently in return. A new day had dawned. The villain's rule had been undone. A protector of fire and brimstone stood alongside an earthborn guardian and the child of time. Everyone could rest, confident that the ghost of vengeance and the Earth's angel would protect the world as long as time endured. Before the ice formed in the pools and before the skaters went, before any check at nightfall was tarnished by the snow, bells rang out to the wild sky. The flying cloud and the frosty light presided over the year dying in the night. The rider put his hand to his ear and heard a sound rising over the snow. It began low and slowly grew until the sound of crying filled the air. On Christmas Eve a robbery took place. Japan glowed in the cold night as the rider's resolve flared. He put a hand to his chin and watched as the thieves moved through the street, chanting a hollow justification for taking what others had. One of the robbers shouted demands for money and threatened those who resisted. Bullets streaked through the air like stinging sparks. In the sudden chaos, one of the robbers was struck and fell. The others dashed for cover, weaving through alleys and toward a waiting getaway car. As they scrambled, one was tripped and tangled by a heavy chain, and another collapsed before reaching the vehicle. Two managed to get away while two remained. The rider stepped forward and ordered the remaining attackers to stop. He warned them to hold their horses and be patient, promising that in judgment he would be lenient. One robber begged desperately for mercy. The rider, stern and cold as winter, listened, then reminded him that he had responsibilities beyond the night, a child waiting at home. Though his eyes glowed with the intensity of his duty, he chose to let the desperate man go with a warning that he would be pursued if he tried again. In the quiet that followed, the rider's thoughts softened. To him she was more than a symbol of hope, she was someone he admired deeply. Her voice and laughter stirred his emotions and left him momentarily speechless with nervousness. The intensity of those feelings reminded him of how much he had to protect. He turned from the scene and began the walk home, steady and resolute. He thought of his little girl waiting for him, and he imagined the warmth of returning to her side. He told himself he would be home soon. He would bring comfort and the small delights of the season. At home, his white-haired child awaited him, and he no longer felt alone. He promised his daughter that he was coming, that her mother's cake would bring them joy, and that he would embrace her when he returned. Above them, strange celestial voices marked the night with their own celebration. A pair of otherworldly beings watched the rider's dark green hair with amused reverence, manifesting a horn and a halo as they laughed together. They toasted the protector of the world, praising the guardian whose courage burned like glittering gold. They spoke of a future contest with an opposing force and hailed the rider, invoking his name as a champion against the darkness. And so the night closed on quiet streets and a small household warmed by reunion, the rider carrying his duty and his family in equal measure.